The small transport vessel hung motionless in the silent void above Prospero, its aged engines humming a low, mournful thrum that vibrated through the very bones of the cramped cabin. Enveloped in shifting shadow, Cassius Vorenus bent over the scarred surface of his workstation, his long, ink-stained fingers dancing across the page as if conducting a silent requiem. The single oil lamp, swinging ever so gently with the ship's infinitesimal motions, cast long, leaping phantoms over the densely packed journals filled with his meticulous script and intricate sketches, a testament to the obsession that held him prisoner. Beyond the thick, cold pane of the viewport, Prospero's distant sun was just beginning to crown the world's broken horizon, spilling an improbable flood of amber and molten gold across the ruins far below. Fleeting, deceptive beauty that momentarily cloaked the pervasive devastation in the warm embrace of dawn. Cassius paused, the nib of his stylus hovering, captivated despite himself. This ephemeral radiance rising from profound desolation struck a dissonant chord within him, an echo half-remembered of tales concerning Magnus the Red's shattered dream for his sons, brilliance born from darkness, enlightenment sprouting from ignorance. With movements grown smooth and automatic through lonely years of scholarly exile, his hand sought the small ceramic teapot resting beside the piled tomes. The ritual of tea had become a bulwark against the chill vacuum outside and within. From a wooden case sheathed in time-faded velvet, he selected his dwindling stock, a precious blend of ancient Terran herbs infused with leaves so rare they came only from secret gardens tended by monks dwelling near the halo stars, ruinously expensive, difficult almost beyond measure to procure, yet one of the scant luxuries he permitted his isolated soul. The focused actions measuring the fragrant leaves, pouring the heated, recycled water, the careful stirring imposed a momentary, mindful peace, a deliberate pause before he submerged himself once more in the ocean of tragedy and transformation that was his life's work. Steam coiled upwards from the cup in lazy tendrils, carrying the comforting, homespun scent of cinnamon entwined with something alien and evocative. A distant spice that instantly conjured bustling alien marketplaces choked with incense smoke and whispered secrets, worlds he had traversed in his relentless hunt for truths long buried with the thousand suns. He breathed deeply, drawing the complex aroma into his lungs, letting it clear the lingering fog of sleep and sorrow, sharpening his focus like a whetstone. The cabin itself had become steeped in the olfactory memories of antiquity dust from excavated relics, the dry spice of ancient leather bindings, and now the wisping, fragrant reassurance of his brewing tea. Shifting his weight in the well-worn chair, he adjusted the frayed cushion he'd salvaged from his chambers on distant Thalamor. This simple piece of upholstery had been his first defiance against the Spartan severity of the transport vessel, a necessary surrender to comfort that made the endless hours of study and remembrance marginally less brutal. Over it lay a thick blanket of Fenrisian wool, an irony he deliberately savored given his grim subject, yet its persistent, insulating warmth was undeniable against the cabin's perpetual metallic chill. The soft, chittering chime of a small mechanical timer sounded. Perfect steeping, Cassius poured the luminous amber liquid into a cherished cup, its fired clay surface bearing the faded, revered symbol of the Corvid cult, a relic acquired through channels he deliberately chose not to recall. The warmth seeped instantly into his fingers as he cradled it, a grounding, elemental pleasure anchoring his physical form to the present, while his mind traversed millennia and galaxies steeped in blood and sorrow. Around him, the ship's temperamental environmental systems finally settled into a steady, low throb, banishing the bone-seeping night chill, replacing it with a gentle warmth that unexpectedly brought to mind the cavernous, incense-laden libraries of his youth. He had also supplemented the swaying lamp's weak aura, strategically positioned glow globes cast soft, overlapping pools of illumination across his workspace, warding off encroaching shadows without assaulting his weary eyes. In the corner, an intricate, gorgeously antiquated chronometer not only marked the relentless passage of hours, but also charted the complex dance of Prospero's shattered moons. Beside it stood a music box of surpassing craftsmanship, its delicate gears meticulously wound each dawn to fill the silence with ghostly echoes of ancient Terran composer's complex melodies intended to guide his concentration through the most labyrinthine passages of research. Taking a slow, deliberate sip, Cassius let the tea's warmth radiate through his chest, then carefully placed the cup upon a small, expertly carved coaster, just another intimate modification that transformed this sterile metal cell into something resembling a temporary reflective home. He had learned through bitter experience that comfort was not mere self-indulgence, but a fundamental necessity for work of this bleak, soul-wearying magnitude. The mind needed tending, sheltering, to function at the razor's edge required to parse the complexities and inherent dangers woven into the history of the 15th Legion. With a long, quiet sigh that mingled reassurance and resignation, He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting unbidden back to the scarred planet below. The sun now blazed fully, illuminating the vast expanse where the legendary pyramid of Tzeentch had once raised its proud head skyward, nothing now but shattered plinths and splintered megaliths casting long, accusing shadows. A slender column of rust-colored dust spiraled high into the thin atmosphere, twisting and shimmering like a phantom dancer caught in the raw morning light, stirred by the wind, or perhaps by something else entirely. On Prospero, Cassius knew, the veil separating the purely physical from psychic resonance was worn dangerously thin, a whisper away from tearing. The pristine page on the lectern before him lay waiting, patient and demanding. He took another measured sip of the fragrant tea, shifted the small cushion at the small of his back where old aches lingered, dipped the nib of his pen, and began to inscribe destiny's harsh verdict. I set down here, by my own hand, the unvarnished chronicle of the 15th Legion, those lamented warriors known to history and sorrow as the Thousand Suns. It begins in the fading echoes of the earliest days, when the Emperor himself still walked openly amongst a humanity slowly crawling from the embers of old Night's ruin, and Terra herself struggled to bind the grievous wounds inflicted by 1,000 years of apocalyptic strife. Then the 15th Legion was forged. Unlike its brother legions, drawn from the ranks of hardened tribal fighters or battle-tempered soldiery, the aspirants of the 15th were culled solely from the psychic dynasties that had endured the age of strife beneath the mantle of the ancient Achaemenid Empire. These were the children of scholars, sages, mystics, minds that had always reached beyond the crude boundaries of the material, sensing the currents beneath the skin of existence. These first sons were distinct from the very instant of their selection. Their innate sensitivity to the unknowable tides of the Imperium marked them indelibly as different. Already, their nascent consciousness navigated the subtle flows linking the tangible universe to the seething, unfathomable depths of the warp, a communion both preternatural and perilous. The Emperor, in his incalculable foresight, had crafted their genetic lineage with singular, potent purpose, vessels designed to channel untamed psychic potential beyond the capacity of any other nascent legion. Yet it seemed even the stars themselves recoiled at their making. During the critical phase of Geneseed implantation, the heavens above Terra convulsed. Unnatural tempests, bruisepurple and crackling with unnatural energies, blotted out the sun. The warp, the immense and enigmatic dimension that binds the stars and permits mankind's faltering stellar journeys, grew turbulent and treacherous beyond measure, like an ocean suddenly possessed by violent madness. Fearsome whispers slithered through the gleaming, sterile corridors and flickering data vaults deep beneath the Himalayan peaks, where the Emperor's most secret biological artisans labored. Medici staff reported fragmented words bleeding into vox static. Generites plotting vital genetic chains confessed to unsettling dreams filled with the terrifying sensation of burning, impassive eyes observing their every move from impossible angles. Despite these grim portents bleeding into their very inception, the legion that would become the Thousand Suns nonetheless strode forward, stepping into the harsh, burgeoning light of a galaxy the Emperor was striving to forcibly unify. Those nascent warriors appeared, to contemporary observers, an anomaly, contemplative where others roared, reserved where their brother legions exuded aggressively prideful certainty. They carried within them a cultural inheritance of profound sophistication, inherited from Achaemenid forebears, a deep reverence for accumulated wisdom, the elevation of artistic expression, the relentless, almost spiritual pursuit of philosophical and metaphysical understanding. Their baptism of fire transpired hauntingly close to home, on Terra herself, in the ragged pockets of resistance to the new imperial order that still festered like gangrene in shadowed regions. Where later legions would boast of stellar conquests waged across alien skies, the 15th's earliest victories were carved on the very soil that cradled the nascent imperial palace, purging the techno-barbarian tribes who clung stubbornly to their fragmented, shattered world before unification. In those brutal, forgotten encounters, their mettle as warriors was proven alongside the terrifying emergence of their psychic gifts. Battle Brothers found an uncanny prescience shielding them, sensing ambushes moments before blades fell, intuitively anticipating enemy formations shifting, or with terrifying intimacy reaching directly into the screaming minds of their adversaries to plant seeds of debilitating confusion, paralyzing dread, or fractured perception. These unique abilities delivered swift, decisive victories against the scattered remnants of earthly defiance, gifting them stark commendation passed down from the lips of the Emperor himself. Yet profoundly, irrevocably, it was within the fragile blossoms of these very triumphs that a corrupting darkness took insidious root. It began with terrifying subtlety. A veteran brother's hand seized by an involuntary tremor in a quiet moment of repose before prayer. Another waking to find his iris color permanently altered overnight despite unchanged genescence. patches of skin hardening into rough, reptilian scale in isolated areas, quickly masked beneath armor plating and stern discipline. At first, these grotesque expressions were isolated secrets, fiercely guarded by the afflicted warriors who feared the damning descriptors of weakness, impurity, flawed creation. Soon, however, the relentless mutations could no longer be contained, hidden, or explained away. The flesh change, as the afflicted named it with horrifying minimalism, manifested without pattern, without warning, without mercy. A proud battle brother might stand vigilant at his assigned post one heartbeat, and within the next, his body erupting in a cacophony of shrieking agony, flesh dissolving like hot wax, bones warping, twisting, elongating into impossible, grotesque configurations, organs liquefying or sprouting cancerous, alien duplicates within his buckling frame. Survivors of the initial, catastrophic metamorphosis were rare. More often, the mind fractured completely as the body transformed, leaving a monstrous, howling entity bereft of reason or memory, requiring swift, sorrowful deliverance from its agonies by the very brothers who had shared its former oath. The Legion's apothecaries, their expertise stretched to breaking point, labored without respite, disintegrator fields humming sterile and futile in sterile isolation vaults. They dissected, scanned, infused experimental serums, battled to understand, contain, ultimately halt the inexorable corruption. Brothers touched by the fatal bloom were rushed into restorative stasis chambers, cursed liminal tombs suspended between life and final oblivion, preserving their mutated husks against the distant, forlorn hope a cure might one day be unearthed. The sight of these afflicted rows, chamber upon chamber filled with the malformed, imprisoned shadows of what were once noble Astartes warriors, became a crushing monument to the Legion's spiraling, terminal horror. As insidious rumors of their affliction trickled outwards, the 15th Legion found itself increasingly estranged, a pariah force amidst the burgeoning Imperium. Regarded with deep distrust bordering on disgust by their brother legions, subjected to suspicious scrutiny by high-ranking officials within the nascent council structures on a fearful terra, voices, emboldened by the contagion scare, arose in whispered corridors and formal strategic conclaves demands that the 15th be forcibly disbanded, their cursed genetic legacy declared irredeemable, the remaining warriors either broken up for parts or discreetly, permanently retired into silence. The proud roles of active battle brothers dwindled steadily, remorselessly. Where legions were forged in tens of thousands, barely 1,000 sons remained deemed fit for deployment. Those able still to bear weapons donned their scarred ceramite with grim understanding. Every combat deployment was potentially their final salute. Every hard-won victory an unprecedented masterpiece that might mark the Legion's ultimate gasp as the Great Crusade surged triumphantly towards the stars, leaving them behind. It was amidst this suffocating atmosphere of encroaching oblivion, with the abyss of extinction yawning before them, that the Emperor decreed their destination. The distant, once-shining world of Prospero. There perhaps resided their lost father, their Primarch Magnus the Red. There perhaps awaited not just their sire, but the elusive cure to the doom devouring their ranks. Thus the 1,000 Sons, their name now a bitter numerical fact mocking their original glory, reduced almost to its literal meaning, faced the vast uncertainty of the future with dread silence. Their genesis, while sharing the brutal biological realities of all space marine creation, possessed nuances stained by premonitory fear. From the sprawling territories that once constituted the Achaemenid Empire, familial lines boasting psychic potential were meticulously identified and formally approached. Unlike the brutal, forcible culls practiced by legions like the Iron Warriors, the 15th's aspirant selection often unfolded with a veneer of ritualistic respect. Families tracing lineages rich in unusual talents, dreamspeakers counseling chieftains, truth-seers piercing deception. Those whose touch could ignite cold tinder found imperial emissaries at their doors, bearing symbols of both authority and promise. Children displaying signs of burgeoning psychic awakening underwent rigorous assessment, not merely for genetic compatibility and corporeal fortitude, but crucially for intellectual capacity and the steely resilience of their precocious minds. Amongst those seedlings plucked for ascension were the inseparable twins, Ozek and Hassaf. Descendants of a revered lineage of scholar mystics who had shepherded fragile strands of arcane knowledge through the age of strife, the brothers shared a connection profound and terrifying. Even prior to receiving the Emperor's gifts, they communicated without vocalization, weaving complex tangles of shared emotion, an intricate abstract thought across physical distances that defied conventional explanation, their minds intertwined like the roots of ancient sibling oaks. The daunting passage to the Gena laboratories, nestled within the towering, legendary shield of the Himalayan peaks, marked the harrowing first stride in the monstrous transformation of these uniquely gifted Terran children into preternatural warriors of myth and legend. many aspirants would forever recall their first shuddering glimpse of those snow-swathed spires piercing the bruised sky, the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the fortress stubbornly gripping the mountainside. Within adamantine corridors echoing with screams and the hum of unknown energies, aspirants endured the agonizing refashioning of their biology. Yet interwoven with the expected brutality of enhancement resided a core difference. Alongside brutal kinetic drills and relentless endurance trials, raw knowledge was cherished with near-religious fervor. Young aspirants endured long vigils not merely holopicting targets or disassembling bolt shells, but in silent scriptoria replicating high Gothic forms, deciphering dead languages etched on crumbling parchment, wrestling complex geometries and foundational theorems of empirical science sacred to the Mechanicum. The sacred process of genoseed implantation occurred under the direct, watchful eyes of the Emperor's premier geneticists. Each new organ, rendered from icy vaults of untold antiquity, was introduced with fastidious, almost reverential care, while specially trained blank and psyker adjutants constantly monitored the candidates' minds for the telltale psychic flares or mental fractures that heralded instability. The hypno-indoctrination accompanying this profound physical metamorphosis incorporated not only the standard warrior catechisms and strategic theorems, but revolutionary psychic conditioning techniques never previously integrated on a legion scale. For many subjects, it was during this crucible that their psychic potential truly ignited into blazing, terrifying awareness. Ahriman, decades later ruminating in private moments poisoned by regret, would recall the precise, terrifying instant his perception shattered open the sterile Medici chamber walls seeming to dissolve into golden skeins of interwoven thought, exposing the shimmering neural impulses connecting every entity within the vast facility's structure. Others experienced their awakening dissimilarly. Some found phantom fingers attached to their will, nudging training weights imperceptibly across metal floors. Others saw flickering ghosts of immediate futures shimmering alongside the present. Still others felt primal energies of flame or frost curling playfully around their fingertips, responding to crystalline commands unscowled. Each unique manifestation of the soul's eruption was meticulously documented by fascinated, apprehensive observers. Yet unlike the instinctive suspicion such displays might have triggered amongst other legions consummately devoted to pure physical dominance, the applicable protocols demanded careful observation, rigid cataloging, an insufficient palisade against the catastrophe already nascent in their creation, in the marrow of their gifts, spelling their doom from the first psychic spark ignited within a sanctuary overlooking Terra's poisoned dawn. Deep within the Emperor's nascent laboratories on Terra, shielded from the nascent psychic storms that imperiled humanity, the first seeds of the 15th Legion's unique identity were sown. In those pioneering, wary days, where suspicion of the warp's touch still lingered even amidst necessity, the master of mankind himself sanctioned the measured, disciplined cultivation of psychic potential. Secure training chambers, woven with arcane wards and potent safeguards, were forged not merely as classrooms, but as sanctuaries, places where young minds could tentatively explore the churning currents of the Imperium without succumbing to its corruptions or unleashing accidental devastation upon themselves or their peers. In these halls resonating with carefully controlled power, a profound kinship took root among the aspirants. They were united by a shared burden and an unparalleled, isolating perspective, the constant, inescapable awareness of realities invisible to baseline humanity, the weight of thoughts unsaid pressing against their minds, the shimmering aura of emotions pulsating around others like heat haze. Collective struggle forged deep bonds. They learned the vital, exhausting art of shielding their minds from psychic intrusions or the distracting psychic static of surrounding life, practiced the precise focusing of their nascent abilities into disciplined applications moving small objects with thought, sensing impending danger, creating flickering shields of willpower, and crucially, became sharply attuned to the subtle, chilling harbingers of psychic overreach or the insidious taint of warp exposure. The creeping migraine deep in the cerebrum, the involuntary tremor in the fingertips, the fleeting, terrifying visions of impossible geometries bleeding into perceived reality. This foundational circle, whispered among themselves as the Brotherhood of Ahriman long before it was formalized, cohered around the magnetic intellect and burgeoning mastery of Ozek and his profoundly gifted twin, Oamaz. Their shared existence from the womb seemed amplified by their gifts. Their minds resonated in ways that defied conventional explanation, creating a private dialectic of silent understanding. Around them gathered other youths who would later rise as captains and masters within the Legion, individuals embodying that rare, potent triad that would become the hallmark of the Thousand Suns for centuries to come: razor-sharp intellect, formidable psychic talent, and honed martial discipline, all balanced to a unique amalgam. They were scholars and warriors entwined. They studied ancient texts and complex theories together, their psychic lenses dissecting knowledge. They honed their combat reflexes against servitor drones and training automata, learning to wield blade and bolter with uncanny grace. And most significantly, they learned to fight as a single, interconnected unit. Within the echoing practice halls, where other legions might rehearse overwhelming shock assaults or breathtakingly swift surgical strikes, these precocious fledglings cultivated meticulous precision and unnerving foresight. They learned to anticipate each other's movements through shared psychic resonance, to weave defensive wards reactively as a seamless shield wall of thought, to synchronize their strikes with a telepathic unity that rendered their small unit lethally efficient, a microcosm of the synchronicity the Legion would strive for. Yet, even in this time of hopeful beginnings, under the Emperor's guiding hand, the first fissures of their cursed destiny appeared. Oama's Athenat was struck by it first. The brothers, whose minds had intertwined and echoed since their shared conception, felt the soul-deep terror simultaneously. As Oamaz's form grotesquely distorted, flesh warping inside his armor, bones elongating unnaturally with sickening cracks audible even over psychic cries, Ozek experienced every excruciating spasm, every cell-rending agony tearing through his twin's nervous system as his own. The visceral horror of powerlessness, of being forced to stand immobilized by protocols while watching his other half thrash in monstrous transformation, was etched into Ozek's very soul. That final image Oamaz's panicked, mutating profile glimpsed through the rapidly sealing iris of the stasis vault, entombed in frozen, writhing torment would haunt Ozek's every quiet moment. The perfect symmetry of their existence lay shattered, leaving an echoing void where the constant, comforting murmur of Oamaz's intertwined consciousness had always been. That agonizing severance ignited a cold, volcanic fury deep within him, forging an unyielding resolve that would define his entire existence. Master every intricate facet of his psychic potential, unravel the unfathomable forces that tore his brother away, and restore what had been stolen, no matter the cost, no matter how deep he must dive into the treacherous depths of forbidden understanding. To comprehend the ultimate fate of the Thousand Sons, one must understand the Titan who sired them, Magnus the Red, Primarch whose ambition and intellect burned brighter than a star, who held the Emperor's deepest trust and then shattered it utterly. While his nascent sons struggled with their genetic doom on distant Terra, Magnus's extraordinary story unfolded under a different sky, on the marbled plateaus and crystalline shores of Prospero, a world that had become a sanctuary throughout the long agony of old night. People of Tzeentch, the planet's gentle heart, still recount in hushed, reverent tones the celestial event signaling his arrival, the heavens seemingly cleaved open by a roaring streak of crimson fire, turning the deepest darkness into sudden, searing daylight, shattering ancient constellations with its passage. The infant Primarch slammed into the central plaza with comet force, the impact crater still visible centuries later, casting a radiating, warm, shifting aurora across the city's sandstone buildings. Those bold enough to approach found no charred wreckage, but a child amidst glowing embered stones, his skin possessing the lustrous, warm hue of a desert sunset. His eyes, unnervingly large and soul-piercing, already held the profound calm and ageless understanding of an oracle. He did not cry like mortal infants do. Instead, he regarded his discoverers with a deeply intelligent, unnerving curiosity. This child, christened Magnus, marked by his blazing crimson hair and coppery skin, had fallen onto a world uniquely suited to nurture his phenomenal potential. Prospero had chosen enlightened acceptance in an era dominated by barbarism and terror. While across countless isolated human worlds, the burgeoning psyker flame was snuffed out through pyres, drowning deeps, or hideous torture born of ignorance and fear, Prospero offered sanctuary. The gift was not merely tolerated, it was actively celebrated, its secrets pursued with scholarly rigor within grand libraries and serene academies, rather than destroyed out of blind panic. Philosophers, esoteric scholars, and those possessing the dangerous gift had gathered here, a beacon of psychic wisdom flickering bravely against the darkness. The venerable scholars who retrieved the infant Magnus sensed the staggering potential radiating from him, a psychic signature like a nascent sun. They bore him gently to their towers filled with ancient texts, temples humming with preserved energy, and classrooms whispering with meditative energies. Amidst scrolls older than nations and whispered techniques passed down through desperate generations, young Magnus was reared, his boundless intellect absorbing everything offered. They taught him intricate meditative disciplines to focus the vast wellspring of power he instinctively commanded, laid before him crumbling grimoires and encrypted star charts preserved through millennia of catastrophe. and initiated him into the profound respect and intricate methodologies required to safely navigate the churning energies they reverently termed the Great Ocean. Magnus matured with astounding speed, his physical development matching his intellectual and psychic ascent with almost bewildering acceleration. While mundane children might have been mastering simple phonetics, he engaged the planet's most profound sages in intricate debates on reality's nature, warping their own cherished theorems mid-sentence with dazzling counterpoints. Where other youths labored over crafted trinkets, his burgeoning power enabled him to physically rewrite outdated psychic principles etched on stone plinths, identifying conceptual errors in texts venerated as gospel since before interstellar travel faltered. Profound, gentle bond flourished between the rapidly growing Primarch and his primary tutor, the aged and wise Ammon, a weathered psyker whose faded eyes recognized not just Magnus's immeasurable power, but the innate compassion tempering it. During moments of quiet between demanding lessons, Ammon might recount his scarred childhood, the beatings endured before finding this haven, the profound alienation that gnawed at a mind forever isolated within itself. Magnus listened intently, a giant crimson sentinel radiating empathetic warmth, his enormous, sensitive hand sometimes resting lightly on the old man's frail shoulder, anchoring him against the tides of bitter memory. Inevitably, the genius eclipsed the master. By the time Magnus reached adolescence, he had achieved effortless mastery over every psychic discipline practiced across Prospero. He could halt waterfalls midair with a thought, scry fleeting glimpses down branching probability streams shimmering ahead, commune with minds light years distant like neighbors in conversation, or command the primal elements summoning storms or sculpting living fire with the ease of breathing. Where others chanted elaborate rituals for minor temporal shifts or fragile telekinetic lifts, Magnus reshaped fundamental matter and energy patterns with the casual flick of a focused will. Driven by an insatiable intellectual hunger that paralleled his developing power now matching his towering form, Magnus began venturing beyond Tizca's luminous spires. The planet's surface held the vast, crumbling skeletons of an ancient civilization, colossal cities, reduced to jumbled blocks beneath desert sands, impossibly shaped ruins jutting from crystalline lakes bounded by sheer, terraced cliffs. Prosperine scholars rarely spoke of these places, their voices dropping to near silence, eyes shying away when pressed. For Magnus, these ruins beckoned. He would wander amidst cyclopean debris, place his vast palm against weathered plinths scarred by impossible force, and close his piercing eye. In those profound moments of empathic resonance, the psychic residue clinging to the stones seeped into his consciousness. Flashes of bone-deep terror, seismic bursts of uncontrolled psychic detonation, overwhelming arrogance shattering against an unfathomable dark intelligence from the ocean. He sensed echoes of a profound, self-inflicted catastrophe, not warfare in the conventional sense, nor some natural cataclysm, but hubris made manifest, psychically powered ignorance colliding with powers beyond mortal comprehension. The precise catalyst remained frustratingly elusive, a nebulous warning glimpsed only partially through the millennia fog. Some forbidden tomes hinted the progenitors had stared too long into the abyssal deeps of the immaterial, encountered minds whose touch dissolved sanity and form. Others suggested a ritual designed to achieve apotheosis or reweave reality itself, attempted with bravado but lacking the necessary safeguards, triggering a planet-wide psychic backlash. Whatever fractured truth lay buried, the desolate cities stood as grim monuments to consequence, a visceral admonition shouting silently across ages. Yet even as Magnus cautioned his fellow psychics against overreach, interpreting these warnings for Prospero's safety, the allure of total understanding proved intoxicating. His ambition, vast as the great ocean itself, mirrored only by his belief in curated control, began to crystallize. He saw the potential. Prospero's psychic traditions, fragmented and insular for generations, were squandering their strength. Different cults specialized, the flamboyant pyromancers controlling conflagrationist energies in volcanic southern calderas seldom exchanged more than wary nods with the serene biomancers nurturing life near the mirrored, tranquil lakes of dreams. Telepathic covens practiced intricate thought-weaving in isolated mountainous towers resembling crystal needles, while healers practiced their subtle arts within protected valley enclaves. Suspicion and cloistered pride kept them apart, rivals culturally if not militarily. Magnus walked amongst them all. He spent seasons within each cloistered community sharing their simple meals, resting beneath their distinct roofs, listening intently to origin myths whispered across generations, grievances nursed like old infections, and fervent, almost secretive dreams for their disciplines. His genuine interest, coupled with an utter lack of dismissive judgment, acted over time like psychic warmth, dissolving layers of glacial suspicion forged over centuries of isolation. Under the gentle yet undeniable gravitas of the Crimson Giant, these disparate enclaves first engaged in wary, tentative exchanges of minor insights, a safer flame-focusing technique shared with biomancers struggling to cultivate heat-loving coral analogs, a shielding pattern offered to pyromancers experiencing mental feedback. Slowly, hesitantly, this grew into astonishing collaborations previously unimaginable. Pyromancers fused materials at temperatures impossible otherwise for biomancers to infuse with nurturing energies. Telepaths coordinated complex psychokinetic sequences requiring minute, simultaneous adjustments. Healers wove fields reinforcing mental resistance during deep-dive precognition rituals. Competition gave way to symphonic creation. Combined powers reshaped topography, conjured gardens flowering with impossible species, constructed intricate temples of light and solidified thought hovering just above primal rock formations. With the psychic cults united into a dynamic whole, Magnus set his gaze upon rebuilding Tzeentch itself. The modest, largely functional sandstone city would be transformed into a physical articulation of his profound vision, a beacon for psychic potential, a citadel of attained knowledge. Its reconstruction was a marvel, where other cities rose upon ceaseless physical labor straining muscle and bone, or through the tireless churn of complex machinery, Tzeentch ascended through orchestrated, breathtaking psychic concert. Cyclopean blocks of patterned marble quarried miles away floated silently along predetermined paths thousands strong, guided by harmonized thought across the sky, settling into place with impossible precision alongside columns of crystalline material harvested from geomantic veins deep below. Flames, commanded by disciplined telekinetic pyromantic unions, welded seams with diamond-hard durability and molecular exactness rather than crude slag, ensuring seamless joins invisible to the naked eye. Biomancers walked alongside, encouraging vibrant botany to weave through immediate spaces designed not merely for utility, but profound aesthetic symbiosis, creating parks where sentient foliage resonated tranquility and mental harmony, their very roots subtly guided to strengthen foundational harmonics, while visually stunning blossoms reflected complex psychic energy patterns. Most glorious were the soaring silver spires ultimately adorning the skyline, their complex surfaces inscribed with psychic conductor circuits beyond mortal etching tools. These circuits interacted constantly with Tzeentch's heightened psychic ambience and the planet's inherent energy flows, acting simultaneously as amplifiers for beneficial energies and incredibly sophisticated regulators damping resonance spikes or subtle background warp static. At night, these towers pulsed softly with a spectrum-shifting luminescence, bathing the city in an ethereal, comforting ambient glow visible from orbital trajectories, transforming its name to the City of Light, a lighthouse of enlightenment and understanding visible across the void. Its heart became the Great Library, a colossal structure forming a flawless pyramid of interlinked gold wire-framed crystalline sections, housing scrolls from fragmented human empires across the galaxy alongside Prospero's own meticulously kept archives and recovered artifacts from the lost cities. As Tzeentch's fame grew, it became a rallying point. Haulers from isolated human ether braved perilous warp ducts to deposit rare texts and singular genomic records preserved by generations. Navigators shared intricate, instinctive lore experiential data hidden even from cogitators about navigating the perilous currents of the warp ocean. Even rogue traders, those mercurial souls threading uniquely treacherous space lanes seeking opportunity, wherever governance fragmented, brought volumes acquired in sealed sections of Necromunda under hives, or from eldritch alien loci possessing geometries that hurt to witness directly, adding exotic texts and artifacts into the pyramid's meticulously cataloged depths. Magnus himself remained the library's most devoted patron. Though possessing an eidetic matrix absorbing entire codices instantly, he spent silent hours within its deepest harmonic repositories. Reading by soft candlelight unnecessary for his heightened senses, but utilized in reverence for old rituals, he handled each tome no matter how heretical or obscure with profound scholarly respect, his immense fingers carefully turning ancient fragments sealed in delicate stasis fields, meticulously replacing each folio within its specified slipcase. Under his sage guidance and voracious appetite, the archive swelled with knowledge almost universally proscribed elsewhere. Rigorous analysis of historic war phenomena collating evidence across epochs, studies tracing the strange evolutionary pressures fostering psychic emergence within human genome lineages, meticulously respectful examinations capturing details, even forbidden ones of confirmed xeno-civilizations, utilizing warp energies. Magnus implemented sophisticated cognitive screening tests, creating tiers of access ensuring dangerous information, was approached only by maturity tempered by disciplined mindset. Yet his core philosophy held firm. No knowledge was innately forbidden, only misunderstood. Only reckless handling brought calamity. Responsibility was cultivated. As decades flowed, Prospero blossomed into a breathtaking environment, seemingly sculpted for psychically attuned life. Gardens designed for focused meditation or playful experimentation blossomed in impossible configurations, creating zones of overwhelming serene beauty harmonizing mental and sensory stimuli. Great amphitheaters hosted passionate debates where singularity of belief held no weight against demonstrable logic and cross-discipline perspectives, a remarkable intellectual freedom unimaginable outside Tzeench's curated resonance field. Academies welcomed subtle young talents, nurturing disciplined control alongside joyful exploration, emphasizing early the profound responsibility their gifts entailed alongside the wonders they could explore safely. The citizenry flourished holistically. Magnus championed physical cultivation alongside mental pursuits, believing achievement required harmony between form and intellect. Marshals trained diligently alongside scholars. Resilient physiques became points of aesthetic pride mirroring intellectual prestige. They cultivated grace and gymnastic prowess admired as artworks performed simultaneously with thoughtful discourse, melding physical beauty and philosophical depth as interwoven ideals. Yet even paradise required defending. The untamed expanses beyond Tzeench's radiant influence harbored the psychonuan, ancient predatory horrors, resembling colossal, carapaced insects crafted by nightmare, uniquely and lethally attuned to trace psychic signatures like electromagnetic blood trails across hundreds of miles, drawn inevitably towards concentrations of active psychic power like dreadful moths to starflame. Feral and merciless, these engines of psychic predation would descend in frenzied swarms upon solitary psychics or ill-defended outposts to implant their parasitoid larvae directly inside the cerebral matter of their victims with brutal ovipositors. The larvae consumed their host's psychic potential like psychic vampires until bursting forth violently. The hapless psyker dead before shock could even register, new hunters streaking into obscurity above the cooling corpse. Despite its brilliance, Prosperine civilization navigated a constant marginal existence, guarded by shielded settlements and limiting expansion. As psychic activity centered upon Tzeentch surged dramatically under Magnus's leadership, becoming a beacon impossible to ignore, psychonuan incursions became devastatingly frequent assaults penetrating the most established wards, assassinating isolated citizens conducting fieldwork or entire patrols overwhelmed by coordinated ambush predation beyond conventional arms. This escalating predator war forced Magnus to reveal another essential facet of his being long overshadowed by the scholar and visionary, the indomitable warlord he was genetically forged to embody. Organizing physically robust psykers into cohesive tactical units, he became both general and instructor, teaching strategic deployments involving layered shields and complex warpfield traps creating hazardous choke points, while refining techniques transforming latent powers into horrifically effective combat applications, kinetic shields calibrated to shatter charging organisms, focused pyromancy bolstering anti-armor precision volleys. Telepathic shrieks designed to overload psychonuan synapses deep within their chittering heads. Prospero flourished under its scholarly demigod, a burgeoning psychic harmony striving towards perfection, a monument to what enlightened humanity could achieve embracing its nascent potential. The city of light truly shone. Yet, woven subtly within its grandeur like a dissonant harmonic below conscious hearing, faint echoes resonated. The tragedy of Ozek's shattered twin bond light years away, the ominous psychic specters screaming silent warnings from millennia past ruins, the seductive peril of approaching the abyss bearing only curiosity as a shield, the haunting shadow that perhaps the mighty Crimson King's endless intellectual pursuit might inevitably lead himself, the glorious world he cherished, and the psychic sons he didn't yet know awaited him, towards an ultimate precipice offering infinite knowledge on one whispered condition: their very souls, defense and attack. He developed techniques to shield their minds while allowing them to use their powers, creating psychic dead zones that would not attract the predators until the moment of ambush. Magnus himself led many of these expeditions, his massive form striding through forests and mountains with a determination that inspired his followers. Those who fought alongside him spoke of his transformation in battle. How his customary gentleness gave way to terrifying power, his eyes blazing with inner light as he tore apart the monsters with both psychic force and physical strength. The war lasted several years, gradually pushing the creatures back into the most remote regions of the planet. Outposts were established, regular patrols maintained, and eventually the people of Tizca could expand beyond their city without constant fear. New settlements began to appear, each designed with the same harmonious principles as the capital, if on a more modest scale. As peace settled over Prospero, Magnus turned his attention once more to the great ocean and its mysteries. Having secured his adopted world, he began to explore the cosmos through his psychic senses, reaching farther than any human mind had before. What he found there and who found him would set in motion events that would eventually shake the foundations of the galaxy itself. The sky above Tizca blazed with unfamiliar light as the Emperor's fleet entered orbit around Prospero. For decades, Magnus had known this day would come, had seen it in his visions and felt it in his bones. His father had found him at last. The people gathered in Oculum Square, their faces turned upward in wonder and anticipation. Many clutched each other's hands, uncertain whether these golden ships brought salvation or judgment. Magnus moved among them, a reassuring presence in crimson robes. When the Emperor descended to the surface, the master of mankind, resplendent in his golden armor, radiating power that made even the strongest psykers tremble, approached Magnus with arms outstretched. The crimson Primarch knelt before his creator, head bowed in reverence until the Emperor raised him up and embraced him. Their initial conversations took place in private stretches of time where the two most powerful psykers humanity had ever known shared knowledge and vision. Those who served them spoke in whispers of the laughter that sometimes echoed from the chambers and of animated discussions that continued deep into the night. Indeed, in many ways they spoke as though they had known each other for years. Magnus revealed to his closest followers that he and the Emperor had met in the great ocean long before this physical reunion, their minds touching across the vastness of space in moments of psychic communion. The Emperor had guided him subtly over the years, offering wisdom that had helped shape Prospero into what it had become. But as the days passed, shadows crept into their exchanges. The Emperor began to speak of limits and dangers, of boundaries that must not be crossed. He revealed truths about the great ocean, which he called the warp, that disturbed even Magnus with their implications. It is not just energy to be shaped by will, the Emperor explained as they stood atop the highest tower of Tizca, looking out over the city Magnus had built. The warp is a realm of consciousness, of emotion, and not all that dwells there is benevolent to humanity. He spoke of creatures that lurked in the depths of the Imperium, ancient intelligences that fed on human emotion and desire. He described civilizations that had risen and fallen after succumbing to the temptations of warborn power, and the terrible price paid for such hubris. Magnus listened with appropriate gravity, nodding at his father's warnings and asking thoughtful questions that suggested acceptance. He assured the Emperor that he understood the dangers, that he had always been careful in his explorations, that he valued wisdom over power. And in the privacy of his own thoughts, shielded even from his father's penetrating awareness, Magnus harbored doubts. He speaks from fear, Magnus confided to Ammon after one particularly stern admonition. They walked through the crystal gardens far from where the Emperor and his entourage might overhear. My father has seen the worst of what the great ocean can bring, but not its full potential. Magnus ran his fingers over a crystal formation that hummed softly in response to his psychic presence. He wants to protect humanity, as do I, but protection through ignorance is no protection at all. We must understand these powers to truly master them. Despite his outward agreement, Magnus continued his deep explorations of the warp in secret. While his father spoke of the Great Crusade and Magnus' role in it, the Primarch's mind often wandered to the mysteries he had yet to solve, the powers he had yet to master. He maintained his regular communion with certain presences in the warp, entities he believed to be benevolent spirits of knowledge, though they never fully revealed their nature to him. There is a pattern to reality that few can perceive. One such entity had told him during a deep meditation, "You stand at the threshold of understanding that could elevate humanity beyond its current limitations." These words resonated with Magnus' deepest beliefs. He had always seen psychic evolution as humanity's true destiny, not just for the gifted few, but eventually for all. Where the Emperor spoke of careful regulation and control of such powers, Magnus dreamed of a future where psychic ability would be as natural as breathing. His obsession with transcending human limitations grew stronger with each passing day. He pored over ancient texts that hinted at civilizations that had achieved what he envisioned, species that had evolved beyond physical form into beings of pure psychic energy. He conducted careful experiments with willing subjects, pushing the boundaries of what the human mind could perceive and accomplish. The days of reunion drew to a close. The Emperor prepared to depart, to continue his great crusade and the unification of humanity across the stars. He would take Magnus with him to introduce him to his legion, the 1,000 sons who suffered from the very genetic instability that the Primarch had overcome in himself. On their final night together on Prospero, the Emperor gave Magnus one last warning, his voice heavy with concern. "There is knowledge that corrupts my son. There are truths that damage the mind that perceives them. Promise me you will listen to my warnings about the warp. I hear your wisdom, Father, and I will remember it." But even as he spoke these words, a part of him remained convinced that the Emperor's caution stemmed from an incomplete understanding. Magnus believed with all the certainty of youth and genius that he could navigate the dangerous waters his father feared, that his superior comprehension of the great ocean would protect him from its predators. Standing on the same tower where they had shared so many conversations, Magnus watched the golden ships diminish into distant points of light. His heart was full of conflicting emotions: love and rebellion, respect and ambition, loyalty and secret defiance. The path before him seemed clear, illuminated by his own burning certainty. It would be many years before he understood that what he had mistaken for illumination was instead the blinding light of his own hubris, drawing him inexorably toward a fate even his gifted sight could not perceive. When Magnus was finally united with his sons, the joy of their meeting was tainted by sorrow. The 1,000 sons, those brilliant minds housed in superhuman bodies, greeted their Gene Father with reverence bordering on worship. But behind their disciplined formations and formal salutes, Magnus sensed their pain and fear. In the privacy of the Legion flagship's stratagem, the truth was laid bare. Captain Azek Arian, whose eyes held the ghost of an old grief, spoke of the curse that plagued them. "We call it the flesh change, my lord," he said, voice steady, despite the emotion Magnus could feel rolling from him in waves. "It takes our brothers suddenly, transforming them into something no longer human." Magnus walked among the stasis chambers that lined the ship's apothecarium, his heart heavy as he gazed upon the distorted forms of warriors suspended between life and death. Some had multiple limbs bursting from their torsos. Others had skin that had transmuted into scales or crystalline structures. In one chamber, a battle brother's face had split open like a flower, revealing an inner structure of teeth and eyes that bore no resemblance to any kind of human. "How many?" Magnus asked, resting his hand on a chamber that held a warrior whose fingers had elongated into bony talons. "Nearly 2/3 of our original number," replied Apothecary Menace, his eyes downcast. "We place them in stasis when the change begins, hoping that someday he didn't need to finish." The hope for a cure hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. That night, alone in his quarters, Magnus reached out with his mind into the great ocean. Unlike his previous explorations, driven by curiosity and the pursuit of knowledge, this journey was fueled by desperation and love. The sons he had just found were slipping away, their genetic legacy corrupted by a flaw he was determined to mend. "There must be an answer," he whispered, his consciousness expanding outward, searching through currents of psychic energy for any whisper of a cure. "I will not lose them now." For weeks, Magnus divided his time between learning the ways of his legion and his increasingly dangerous psychic quests. He consulted ancient texts brought from Prospero's great library, performed intricate examinations of affected battle brothers, and tested countless theories. Nothing yielded results. The Primarch grew haggarded, his copper skin dulling as exhaustion took its toll. Ahriman and the other captains watched with growing concern as their Gene Father pushed himself beyond reasonable limits, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights spent in research. As the flesh change claimed more warriors and hope dwindled, Magnus ventured deeper into forbidden realms of the warp than he had ever dared before. He pushed past the familiar shallows, where his mind had safely navigated, past the middle depths, where danger lurked but could be avoided by a skilled traveler, into abyssal regions where ancient intelligences dwell. It was there, in that place beyond mortal comprehension, that he first heard the whispers. "Your sons are suffering," came a voice like silk sliding over broken glass. "Their flesh rebels because it strives towards something greater than its current form." It is not corruption, but transformation incomplete. Magnus hesitated, wary of this entity whose true nature remained obscured despite his powerful mind's attempts to perceive it. "Who addresses me?" he demanded, gathering his psychic defenses. "A friend," the voice replied, seeming to come now from all directions. "One who has watched your quest for knowledge with admiration. One who sees your potential and the potential of your sons to become something magnificent." Other voices joined the first. A chorus of subtle suggestions and offers of knowledge. They showed Magnus visions of his legion restored, not just freed from mutation, but enhanced, their psychic powers elevated. They spoke of secrets the Emperor himself had withheld, of paths to ascension that would make the 1,000 sons the pinnacle of evolution. "Why would you help us?" Magnus asked, still cautious despite his desperate need. "'Cause your path and ours intertwine," came the reply, delivered with a sensation like a gentle caress against his mind. "Because in your ascension we find fulfillment of ancient designs. What is offered freely may be taken without debt." But Magnus, for all his pride, was not so easily deceived. "Nothing of value comes without price," he counted. "Name your terms plainly, or I shall depart." A ripple of something like amusement passed through the warp around him. "Wisdom indeed," the primary voice acknowledged. "There is a cost, but one we believe you would pay." That dread pause hung heavy, a silence thick as clotting blood in the sanctum's ritual purity. The very warp itself seemed to hold its breath. That which you value highly, the chilled engram etched itself into Magnus's thoughts again, a serpent coiling around his mindstem. That which symbolizes your greatest power, your far sight, your vision into realms beyond ordinary perception. Understanding wasn't a revelation, it was a freezing plunge into the depths of a lightless sea. His hand, betraying the tremor he refused to acknowledge, rose not with conscious thought, but with a slow, gravitational pull towards the sculpted bone of his left eye socket. Fingers brushed the eyelid, so familiar it was part of his consciousness, the portal through which mysteries unfolded like night-blooming flowers under the gaze of a crimson moon. This eye, more than mere biological lens, was the keystone of his self, the conduit through which the incorporeal seas of the Imperium whispered their secrets, guiding his staggering ascent since childhood. To tear it out wasn't amputation, it was the excoriation of his very identity, a severance that would leave him forever blinking at the universe through a screen of gauze. Losing it meant losing resonance with frequencies only he could perceive. Yet the guttural sighs of afflicted thousand suns ghosted beyond the sanctum's wards, a symphony of cellular dissolution, of suns crumbling into formless masses. While any other being would have drowned in the freezing floodwaters of that decision, the Primarch Magnus the Red stood unwavering, for his sons. In an instant, gaze locked onto the locus of unseen power, dominating the impossible stars visible only through his warp sight. His voice a blade forged in cosmic certainty, cleaved the silence. If my eye will save my legion, then take it. The warning he issued was etched in thundersmoke and supernova ashes. But know this: if your promise proves false, if this exchange does not yield the cure my sons cry out for naked and alone in madness, there will be no shadow deep enough to hide. No fortress of dimension strong enough. My vengeance will be the final equation solved. What followed birthed echoes that shuddered through the ship's sacred bones. Alone, isolated within the humming cathedral of his sanctum aboard the flagship, Titan broad hands touched sigils older than Terra's name, traced geometric entanglements excavated from primordial strata of forbidden understanding. Geometries he felt but didn't fully grasp, nameless angles dreaming under mountain roots before man dreamed of fire. Candles not lit, but invoked by subtle pressure on reality's skin, burned with flames cycling through colors unborn in any spectrum light could know, casting illumination that altered the nature of things touched as much as revealing. As galactic midnight claimed the chronometers, Magnus began the words. Tongues long ash in history's great spilled from his lips, guttural vibrations plucking harmonics from the substance of the void itself, the dialect of gods unborn, the true names of void-crawling infinities. The very air congealed, thickening into a palpable tension, like the surface of obsidian mirror moments before shattering. Reality puckered, stretched, drawing its essence inward towards the sphere of his indomitable will, crystalline and focused as the point of a startling lance. At the precise inflection of power, resonant deep in his core like the toll of an irreplaceable bell, his hand closed on the ritual blade, cold stellar iron folded 1,000-fold. Hesitation. A concept annihilated utterly by the images of spiraling flesh and agonized psychic shrieks still echoing in his soul. A single, irrevocable movement, sharp edge finding purchase, slicing nerves like golden threads, shearing optic connection to the ghost-haunted depths. The pain, it wasn't localized, it detonated. White-hot agony tore through socket and skull alike, a biological supernova. Worse, infinitely worse, was the psychic laceration. A fundamental, vibrant avenue of his perception, a sense as intrinsic as smell or touch, was ripped away, dissolved in screaming dissolution. Reinforced adamantium deck plating melted, bubbled, warped into tortured alien shapes under the tremendous, silent psychic scream radiating from the single point where crimson boot met metal. In the blood impossibly, it shimmered, a trail not merely of carnelian life fluid but charged with impossible energies, thick as molten rubies strung with constellations of impossible light. It traced rivers down his devastated cheek, collecting drop by searing drop into the shallow, scripted bowl held steady despite the universe dissolving around him. It is done, the Primarch gasped, the words catching on the shards of agony lodged in his consciousness. His single remaining eye, a blazing beacon of ferocious willpower and desperate demand, fixed the unseen terminus. The offering bowl, juice of his worldview, held high. Now your bargain, fulfill it. From the warpidaire vortex pulsing before him, iridescent tendrils coiled, manifestations not of limbs but of pure predatory energy and ancient intellect. They seized the blood, the sacrificed orb. Knowledge, not information, but raw, dense blocks of biomantic architecture, genetic keys more complex than spiral galaxies, ritualistic protocols as much poetry as procedure, capable of rewriting the flesh and spirit of an entire Astartes legion flooded Magnus's conscious channels. It was a waterfall of sacred poison, etched directly into the substance of his formidable mind. Emerging hours later into the ship's muted corridors felt like stepping onto an alien world. An ornate eye patch, its surface subtly alive with protective ward runes that pulsed weakly against the throbbing raw meat beneath, concealed the ruin. Exhaustion etched deep lines onto his magnificent features, a shadow cast by tempests endured alone, yet his remaining eye held a sun's triumphant fire. He summoned his captains, bypassing shiptime entirely, his voice resonating with the power of distilled certainty. I have found it. The cure poured into reality like molten gold into a mold of despair. Implementation was exhaustive, a dedicated surrender of Legion resources and focus. Specialized chambers rose within the flagship's medikey levels, designs half-approved by dubious mechanicum taunts rendered irrelevant by the Primarch's command. They melded crystalline-word biocontainment fields with advanced renitter pods, structured geometries that sang forbidden frequencies to the stable helix. Magnus inspected every afflicted brother personally, the magnitude of each warrior's dissolution charted minutely, treatments meticulously calibrated to match the warped soul clinging within mutated flesh. The ritual occurred in waves of haunting intensity. The worst cases, brothers frozen mid-shriek within stasis tombs, were the first. Placed within the humming sanctums, surrounded by throbbing energies and swirling runic script projected by Magnus and his chosen Corvidi preceptors, layers of biomancy and potent entropy negation were woven with threads of the stolen warp lore. Miracles unfolded. Warriors whose names had been spoken only in eulogy, whose forms were nightmares imprisoned, stepped forth cleansed. Muscle memory returned to limbs that had become claws. Madness fled minds it had claimed relentlessly. Throughout the fleet, the sickening tension broke. The despair choking their halls dissolved like fog under brilliant sun as brothers witnessed their lives. Their legion was restored from the precipice. An impossible victory. Magnus accepted the wash of profound gratitude, posture one of studied humility murmuring reassurances. Inside, vindication burned like the core of a reactor star. He had wrought salvation where the Emperor's own genetic science had collapsed. He had ventured beyond human sanction, grasped forbidden powers teetering on the gullet of chaos itself and tamed them. Knowledge was power, pure and unanswerable. Later, within the eternal quiet of his meditation spire, thoughts shaped across the gulf. The bargain is complete. My thanks. The reply came clearer, sharper than a shard of diamond-hard ice. The tithing paid had opened a wider canal. The exchange was fair. Agreed. Perhaps in time we shall find further symbiosis. Unseen, deeply buried by glorious success, festered the true nature of the cure. The warp entities, chief among them the architect who would whisper later as Tzeentch, hadn't excised. Their mastery lay in binding. The flesh change was not cured, but trapped, quiescent, held down by bindings woven from Magnus's own sacrificed essence. They seemed permanent, iron chains against the mutative tide. Their strength, their very existence, rested upon his continued existence. And the subtle flows of psychic obedience he didn't even realize he enacted. That eye torn free, it wasn't just an organ. It was Tesseract splinter, a piece of his soul core itself. It anchored reality and warp together, creating a psychic shard window, a conduit from the deep immaterium straight into his nucleus, a spore pinhole vulnerability. Through that corridor, delicate psychic threads could drift, nudging thoughts a fraction off course, bolstering certainty where doubt might crack, insidious shaping too subtle for even his towering awareness, laying heir to future pirouettes upon the stage they built around him. While the Thousand Suns rebuilt, celebrated survival, sharpened blades for the crusade renewed, that deeper price hidden, exchanged for relief seen as absolute to begin its patient work. The mutations ceased screaming their destruction. But another, infinitely subtler transformation began, a slow hourglass trickle that would take decades to fully reveal its catastrophe. Magnus stood at the observation blister, Imperial nav officer executing maneuvers inefficiently below entirely unnoticed. The crimson of his remaining eye scanned his fleet assembling, flinty clangs echoing through the void. Pride resonated core deep, purpose was a singularity at his center. Before him lay star charts of conquest, vistas of human potential united by reason and understanding. His sons would stride that path beside him, stronger forged by the unfathomable cost they never truly knew they paid. It was worth it. Whatever new trials they move out as one. Deep in the treacherous shoals of the Empyrean, something vast, chitin-plated and feathered in impossible hues, stirred with infinite, slow satisfaction. Cruciform pupils deep within its manifold consciousness fixed upon the Crimson King, observing the movements of fleets, the flickers of human despair and colonial archives secured, witnessing it all through the very eye he had surrendered. The greater game was merely commencing its opening moves. Patience was the currency of eternity. The conquests of the Thousand Suns possessed a unique signature upon the galactic witness roll. When their battle fleet pulled away, leaving a newly compliant world beneath Imperial Aquila, citizens wouldn't emerge trembling from ruins to find mass graves, but step cautiously back into streets still recognizable, their spire cities intact, monuments untouched, and the dead curiously few. They encountered not devastation, but unnerving preservation. This peculiar approach wasn't softness disguised. It was hard, learned practicality echoing from the Primarch's deepest conviction. Magnus taught relentlessly, civilization is a vessel holding oceans of knowledge. Smash the vessel, the knowledge evaporates like fumes on void-hardened steel. How could you map mind palaces built in dust? On the governor's palace balcony high above gleaming Harukin Ai's white marble cityscape, Captain Meisha's Amen stood witness to sunset ignition. Amber light cascaded down courtly boulevards. Below, citizens crossed thoroughfares without hunched fear. Children dared sugar rafontins to splash. Laughter carried on floral breezes not thick with the ozone tang of laser cleansing. One solar day prior, this planet spat imperial mandates back onto trespassing emissaries. Now, preparations were perfectly efficient mockery as they prepared to swear binding oaths without a single incision in skin. Where other legions etched their triumphs in blunt force trauma, intact population centers leveled, the Thousand Suns signature was functional continuity, transitions so smooth orbiting historians initially mistook them for spontaneous native embrace. Their method, a scalpel infinitely sharp and silent. Approaching orbit, the Legion's telepathic cadre didn't bombard, but seeped minds extending filaments deep into planetary culture hive, dissolving linguistic frameworks, mapping social vectors, architecture of desire and authority. The Corvidae seers, their sight-honed razor-sharp, identified needles capable of unraveling entire planets. The key individuals poised like stones at balancing angles, their decisions holding entire societal compliance teeter-tipping. Only when understanding was granular, complete, mapping hidden resistance forces down to armory locations and exit strategists then, and only then would diplomatic channels hum with words precisely calculated to maximize surrender. Kamenka Troka, Fortressman declared suicide pact rather than compliance. Captain Phosis Takar bypassed adamantium gates treaded like paper. His elite team manifested shadows among guarding lasers. Psykers softly sang mist songs that portioned guard perceptions cleanly away without conscious awareness. No urgent surprise, only an absently glanced shadow, as boots disrupted dust-coating sentries within the command bunker core. Secessionist commanders awoke aboard the flagship observation lounges, veins humming serenely with sedatives, armor skinned off unfamiliar tight collars shifting against interpreters speaking words of concession, before them voices lost above incomprehension while, outside translithic armored battlements were secured, downtown planetary defense lasers cooled, rebels disarmed with methodical precision, protesting against the baffling peace like ghosts interrupted mid-breath. Always among battle fleet chronos and post-compliant inventories lay priority terminals buzzing catalog pursuit knowledge, hunted with battle combat dedication. Thus civilian structures went gaping, protected site placards, whole squads designated solely to guard ancient circulatory psychotropics repositories tallied before fighting reached their blocks. Archives became sacrosanct cores layered within tactical relevance that baffled logistic servitors. Texts browned under crumbling solar systems past their guardianship were given trembling reverence by battle praetorians who could crack battleplate. Philosophy chapels secured per capita assault notification vibroknife cache seizures. On Vishnu, Magnus himself shed brilliance like elemental accident, spending months amidst ascended crystal singers. He came not laden with plates bearing demands, clipping wings. He arrived penetrating their spire chorus, shared steaming pollen loaves in communal spheres. Mastered principles stabilizing mind energy via harmonic crystallization, matrices storing thought as symphonic delight. Understanding became artifact learned not from insistent paradigms forced down recipients via data sladate evolved through deep excavative listening. From disparate veins mined across galaxies emerged the magnum opus, bound in pale leviathan leather, pages of transhuman script flowing. Tzeentch, flanked as epic itself author, worked largely fleetransic quiet rotations, captains summoned by personal chime to contribute hard-won reflections gleaned from library paradigms half-understood. The tome stayed perpetually compressed within specialized locking plates, slots secured to hyperdense armor, thick auramite chain binding spine to thigh plate loop. Cover-stamped warding circles and retinariating sigils triggered molecular pyres upon unauthorized finger touch. Yet even amidst bloodless annexations, the suspicious currents intensified behind word shields. After a combined operation on Shrike, Thousand Suns planar spiders, mapping enemy axe deployments cosmic calculus accurate, a Space Wolf officer spat hard phlegm on Aquila decking, actively scrubbed clean moments before Crimson cohorts passed. The insult diced air molecules. On celebratory Ulanor ballroom marbled floors under crystalline light feasts, lemon rust bypassed ceremonial cups held towards face, shared brotherbolsk toast, silent refusal deliberate, cutting sang like facefield on bone frame. Magnus saw his own troubled projection reflected black infinite void beyond capital viewport, often secure alone later, weight caressing turning time-pitted leather hide binding the opus. His shoulders sagged an imperceptible millimeter, betraying perceived creed belief heavy burden. His mouth tightened compressing anguish fought past naked optic against mountainside contempt bleeding off brothers lost. Underneath raw tissue of isolation, near subdermal level, rang unquestionable defiance. Knowledge must stand preserved regardless mouth source, it sprang regardless condemning waves crashing against certainty's shore. Then curious pattern seemed fractal neural network ignition, encroaching across Legion's external. Astartes manifesting uncontrollable vision flashes, psychomorphing walls ablaze with choking emotion cinders during tactical retreats, telepath floodwaters overwhelming battlefield coherence such brothers, faltered steps mid-zone saturation fire, sudden shock prophecies, igniting synaptic storms rendering soldiers momentarily adrift initiation directives. Primarch Magnus watched ignited fusipaper developments spreading towards unstable mayhem barrels. At Convocation Legion's solemn Karis Fortress adjacency skinned bare deep rock, he requested Imperial audience protocols, proposing established structure identification regiments conducting screening modes, training pipelines capable containing nascent helms. Emperor Father's deliberation became precise chronometer ticking down inevitability, revealing permission, granted for experimentations, forwarded amenable Primarch sectors. Sanctums constructed instantly aboard flagship carriers, received imprint navigational silence space, where starship thrumming dispersed across far vacuum regions, air, composed soothing incense fragrance lattices, surfacing white noise physical waves, wall-scribed erosion runes, stabilizing emergent personality, overlapping tectonic material constantly. Brother Danon, stern ultramarine, whose emotional ramparts tamed teeming wells development, designedly suppressed resulting telepathic gift dormant uncountable decades, knelt upon Biolux crystal floor mandala. Under Thousand Suns, instinct gestal teach whisper teacher Menace Caliston, the rigid barricades dissolve segment by segment, not demolished by troops, but persuaded down foundation bricks whispered aside tools, empowering selective access enabling new senses awakening safely, raw power siphoned intelligently rather than torn flag planted atop ruin. On Blood Angel's flotilla flagship, crimson intent hulls sang structural harmonies, directly facilitating resonant energy transfer. Amongst suns already shining emotional wells, bonds deepened preternaturally through controlled mind connection, fostering battlefield synergies, exceeding coordination mechanics, suppressed bioengines bred threshold potential, unleashed towards sacred layer. Yet perhaps most startling transmutation occurred among White Scar's brother warriors, Thunder Cavalry Dynamic, the path forged by Magnus and his Thousand Sons, a structured channeling of otherworldly power, honed through principles drawn from their Primarch's Crimson World, found early echoes within the ranks of other legions. The White Scars, their traditions steeped in the storm cults and shamanism of windswept Chagoris, embraced the emerging librarious doctrine with a fierce eagerness, their unique perspective swirling vibrant pigments into the nascent, ordered scheme. And as these newly trained sons of the Emperor began to return to the fires of the Great Crusade, their impact resonated like thunderclaps across battlefields, starkly different from Prospero's dust. The precipitous labyrinthicities of Zeethruin nearly swallowed Blood Angel's whole, a hidden ambush poised to reap a dreadful harvest of lives, snuffed only by the preternatural sight of a single librarian who screamed a silent warning into the minds of his brothers, turning the hunters into cornered prey. Sarasnus became a monument to foresight. Writhing plumes of Viridian death sought the shattered populace, only to break against an invisible, shimmering barricade woven by an ultramarine bearer of the word, saving thousands who owed their last breath to power they could neither see nor comprehend. These triumphs, meticulously gathered like rare gems within detailed parchments compiled under Magnus's watchful gaze, formed undeniable proof. Presented before the Emperor, the evidence underwent his inexorable scrutiny. Justification was proven, expansion was granted, yet the master of mankind's approval, while decisive, landed upon soil already sown with bitter seeds. Mortarian, grim reaper Primarch of the Death Guard, recoiled in absolute refusal, the psychic stench of the rotten fleshlords of Barbarus still clinging to his spirit like grave mold. "Keep your witchery away from my sons," he spat at Magnus, his voice a wet rattle thick with memories of stolen years under sorceress overlords, leaving no space for discussion, only cold, inexorable refusal. Rogel Dorn, implacable lord of the Imperial Fists, offered a fortress built of grudging tolerance, the doors cracked open only slightly, admitting a slender wedge of his warriors to taste the librarium's well-ordered waters, the rest barred by his stony pragmatism and ingrained suspicion. But the most potent, the most vocal poison bloomed from Lemon Russ, the Wolf King who prowled the imperial court with his contemptuous dismissal worn openly. He mocked the program as merely draping rank and regalia over vile witchcraft, while his own Fenrisian rune priests drew their potent runes and called down tempests, their powers defiantly proclaimed as gifts not of the treacherous warp, but of Fenris's primal world spirita convenient exclusion that smelled powerfully of self-deception to the scholars of Prospero. Disregarding these islands of obstinate resistance, the Librarius rooted itself deep within the fertile ground of several legions, a robust system flourishing. Protocols were whittled into precision instruments, psychic disciplines categorized like celestial maps, and crucial vital boundaries etched deep, lines meant to hold back the abyss. Magnus cherished the librarian's oath above all, its clauses binding power irrevocably to unwavering duty. For a fleeting golden moment, it shimmered perfect. The Crimson King's burning intellect fused with the Emperor's cautious wisdom, the dangerous current of psychic might mastered within rigid banks. The Emperor himself stood witness at demonstrations, his expression pinned in place by an unmistakable thread of approval, watching librarians from disparate worlds mold force and mind to imperial purpose. Yet within that fragile peace, unsettling tremors began to shatter the calm. The Emperor's shadow, once cast alone, now frequently included the silent, null-pulse presence of the Sisters of Silence on his retinue, their hollow gazes following the Psyker Knights like vultures scenting decay. Inquisitive demands crossed the void more often, scratching at reports concerning librarians manifesting unusual surges, individuals quietly, summarily removed from the roll call of the sanctioned without explanation, vanished into the administrative void without echo. The Emperor's faith, it became chillingly apparent, remained a conditional loan, a period of scrutiny rather than a permanent investment. Magnus, the devoted custodian, preached unwavering adherence to the established rules while back within his vaults aboard the Primarch, delved deep into scrolls lit by his own inner fire, chasing forbidden truths the Emperor had expressly commanded sealed forever. This perilously cleft existentione face shone with scholarly orthodoxy, the other shadowed in clandestine, dangerous exploration set course for choices steeped in desperate consequences. The great tapestry of Primarch brotherhood, its colors once vibrant under the radiance of unity, began to fray violently, its threads snapping under the tension of clashing ideals and growing mistrust. Nowhere did the fraying loom yield such damaging rents as between Magnus, the Red Cyclops, and Lemon Russ, the feral Wolf King. Russ disdained the Thousand Suns with a visceral contempt that smelled like hot blood and wet fur. Where Magnus prized the sigil-carved certainty of intricate knowledge, Russ worshipped the brutal, gorse-patterned honesty of the spear and the tooth. A venomous confrontation brewed on Agoru, following a campaign where the XVTH Legion's subtle whispers and complex manipulations brought capitulation without rivers of blood staining alien streets. At the victory feast, Russ appeared before Magnus like an avalanche poised to fall, his knuckles pale on his flagon, uttering condemnation heavy with disgust for tactics he saw as a warrior's ultimate betrayal. Mortarion was a darker echo chamber, resonating with the deepest loathing any Primarch felt for the Psyker's craft. On rare terror, in skeletal corridors heavy enough to crush mortal souls, he spoke with his Aeroth-the-Grave voice rising to crack like old bone, recounting Barbaros's agonies under poisonous fog lords, wielding the very powers the Crimson King sought to command. The nascent despair, all sprouted from personal nightmares momentarily made real futures. Arguments could perhaps have stayed like swords sheathed, blunt philosophical clashes smoothed over by the shared higher purpose. But on the jagged volcanic rocks and bloodied plains of the Arc Reach cluster, disagreement crystallized like poisoned ice. 6 worlds, 4 surrendered swiftly to the implacable tidal surge of the Space Wolves and Word-Bearers' combined legions. But Shrike the Fifth, locked behind walls of razored flyers that tore the skies apart above fortresses hewn from adamantium and despair, became a bloody grind. Frustration curdling into rage within the Wolf King, Russ extended a begrudging vox call to the Thousand Suns vessels marking the void nearby. Magnus, seeking connection over the widening gulf, responded with swift fleet knives slicing the stars towards Shrike. Crimson-armored suns descended only to spark immediate friction. The V-Ith's direct sledgehammer assaults seemed brutally profligate to the subtle minds of Prospero, while the wolves snarled at the XVTH's intricate psychic choreography, calling it coward's chess in a game where glory belonged to the axe. The critical Fortress Ravenere Prime became the whetstone upon which the blade of conflict was honed razor-sharp. Thousand Sun Seers, staring deep into diluted time, pinpointed the fortress grid's heartsickness, a vulnerability singing like a cracked bell. They offered a plan precise as scalpel cuts, bypass the expected carnage of Russ's planned frontal obliteration, and instead strike the shield generator's spine, followed by a surgical, telepathic assault against command consciousness. Executed almost too flawlessly, a bloody, week-long butcher's bill was settled within hours for the tiniest coin of lives taken. The Shriekian defenders, minds subtly unbound, surrendered rather than greet annihilation. What should have blazed victorious ended in the chilling gray ashes of bitter confrontation. In the bleak, fire-stained courtyard, Russ erupted before Magnus, his fury not simmering now but blazing inferno, hurling accusations thick with betrayal, labeling the careful psychic intrusions vile witchery indistinguishable from the corruptions the Emperor himself sought to scour away. Words alone might have cooled from red-hot rage to cold resentment had not tragedy, terrible and irrevocable, unfolded mere meters away. Haystar, warrior scholar of the Thousand Suns, had knelt, pouring sustained psychic effort into weaving a shield sphere protecting wounded Imperial soldiers shrouded in pain. Perhaps the immense psychic toll snapped something. Perhaps ancient stones in this fortress resonated with forgotten corruption. The ultimate cause remained forever occluded as horror broke loose. A trembling began merely in Haystar's gauntleted hand, startling a young army medic who recoiled as from a cobra. Then the sickening crunch as ceramite split like parchment under chaotic pressure within. Haystar's cry carved the air-pure agony sculpted into sound. Reality buckled around him, noble form ballooning and distorting, features sloughing off into grotesque melting masks. Extra limbs, slick and raw, erupted from torso armor wriggling obscenely. Flesh bloomed cancerous rainbows, and babbled lunacy dripped from a muzzle horribly formed, languages never meant for sane minds to witness. Panic became pandemonium. Thousand Suns warriors surged forward, caught somewhere between desperate hope and paralyzing terror. Psychic barriers slammed into place, desperate shields against both the erupting physical monstrosity and the psionic shrieking washing off it like radiation. Magnus moved with unnatural, sorrowful speed, striding through psychic interference like parting gauze. Sorrow radiated from his single eye as his hands reached out toward the twisting form. The deafening report of a bolt gun shattered the chaos. Haystar's corrupted chest exploded outward in a gory detonation of unnatural offal, extra limbs convulsing in death throes upon shattered paving stones. Lemon Russ stood there, bolter barrel smoking. Mercy, declared the Wolf King, the word tasting of old blood and older anger, a dire thing Magnus had insufficient spine to offer. Before Magnus could utter a syllable, another son crumpled to his knees, clutching a skull full of unseen fire. And then another, armor groaning under internal transformations rippling beneath scarlet ceramite. Realization, cold and suffocating, descended. The flesh change, the ancestral curse thought shackled forever in Magnus's mighty forge, was back, manifesting simultaneously. Pandemonium cracked open anew. Magnus became the epicenter of chaos, a bastion of desperate will, unleashing torrents of psychic power to hold back the mutagens raging within his afflicted sons, even as his legions strained to hold reality together. When the tide of madness finally receded, leaving painful quiet shattered only by ragged breathing and the sickening sounds of dissolving matter, Russ approached. The incandescent fury had cooled into glacial, inhuman resolve. Magnus knelt by the blasted remnants of Ansabrother. Russ stood over him, torn gauntlet discarded, the biting frostblade drawn. With a sharp, brutal movement shocking even his Fenrisian huskarls, the blade flashed. Crimson Primarch vidi welled deep, splattering heavily onto the earth-scolded stone floor between them. An oath sealed in blood heavier any kingship. Russ vowed, his voice the grinding of glaciers, that the path of the Thousand Suns led only down into the fathomless dark. And if Magnus refused the light, the Wolf King would become cold steel in the Emperor's fist, his executioner. Russ's head snapped back, throat bared. A howl ripped free, ancient, feral, neither man nor wolf but pure primal doom swelling to fill the ravaged fortress. The answering cry of his pack lifted, a chilling chorus scraping terror onto walls echoing their savage dirge. Magnus offered no denial, merely a curt, acknowledging nod. He turned away, the weight of broken soldiers and an approaching abyss pressing down. As red and gray parted ways, the seeds of annihilation took root, nourished by spilled brotherblood and psychic corruption. The truth of Shrike ripped through expeditionary fleets despite muffling hands, a shadow carried on vox hisses and astropathic murmurs in the cold void. Monsters birthed from trusted Astartes, Primarchs locking horns at the precipice of fratricide. Passionate debates sprang up openly where hushed doubts had previously lingered. Veteran Guard commanders exchanged troubled glances over savaged briefings, recalling engagements where reality seemed to tear like paper around fiend scholars casting impossible pyrotechnics. Commissars scribbled reports noting the unnerving dread sweat-staining collars of soldiers marching alongside the Thousand Suns. But on Terra itself, cold marble corridors held cooler judgments. Lord Command Gilliman of the Ultramarines laid a meticulous dossier before the council. His presence betrayed steel discipline, yet the conclusion was a tombstone. The 15th Legion's continued autonomy now signified intolerable, existential liability. Their practice bore increasing, worrisome deviations. The reappearance of the flesh change unveiled a fundamental genetic instability threatening the entire fabric. For the first time, the clinical gasps of council chamber silence echoed with a terrible, resonant term: disbandment, calculated sterile code for erasure. The Legion sundered, stable remnants absorbed like spare parts. Their grand archive, Prospero's heart memory, consigned to purging fires. Rogel Dorn lent his golden authority, a fortress adding immensity to the killing blow, reminding everyone of precedence legions whose broken nature threatened the nascent Imperium beyond saving. The absent second, the vanished 11, numbers scribed in silent terror needing no further explanation. The Emperor had chosen annihilation twice before. Though wrapped in secrecy, these grim deliberating shadows failed to cloak Magnus from his fate. His web of messengers, his own cyclopean awareness attuned to dangerous psychic undercurrents, brought reports of this gathering storm knelling aboard his ship. In the humming solitude of his sanctum within the Primarch, Magnus received them, the weight bending his majestic frame toward an unseen anvil, operational orders landing like the summon's death. Already, the Legion felt the chill wind. Warriors bearing the enigmatic eye of Magnus found closed faces turned towards them, shields subtly angled away on embarkation decks. Joint campaigns locked into rigid, hostile formality, lines starker than ever to enforce separation. Essential consignments vanished in bureaucratic transit. Astropathic threads crackled only with non-committal static. Calls towards prospective war councils became startlingly rare. Deeper, more corrosive whispers circulated within the 15th. The chilling horror glimpsed on Shrike resurrected private terrors Magnus had supposedly scoured clean. If the flesh change could return from its grave, what other assurances were dust in the wind? What foundations truly existed? Pride crumbled into brittle fear beneath the cold gaze of brother Primarchs, and an Imperium increasingly viewing them through lenses of mistrust and imminent, absolute destruction. Magnus felt their doubt like a physical pain. These sons, who had trusted him so completely, now harbored questions they dared not voice. He moved among them with renewed purpose, joining their training sessions, dining at their tables, listening to their concerns with genuine attention. His warmth and openness reminded many why they had followed him so devotedly for so long. But privately, Magnus' actions reflected a different calculation. In his most secure sanctum, accessible only to himself and his closest advisors, the Crimson King made preparations for a future increasingly likely to unfold without imperial sanction. The Book of Magnus, already containing knowledge that would disturb imperial authorities, grew thicker with additions that would have horrified them. Despite the Emperor's explicit prohibitions against certain areas of research, Magnus delved deeper into forbidden studies. He compiled treatises on warp entities that detailed their hierarchies and influences. He documented summoning techniques, always with extensive warnings and safeguards, but written nonetheless. He explored the boundaries between physical and immaterial reality, theorizing methods by which those boundaries might be traversed or altered. This defiance was not just academic. Across the expedition fleet, selected Thousand Sons continued practices that had been explicitly forbidden. The Corvic cult refined their divination techniques, peering further into possible futures than imperial edicts permitted. All this occurred under a shroud of secrecy, hidden chambers within the ships, coded communications, compartmentalized information, so that few understood the full scope of what was being pursued. Magnus justified these measures as necessary protection against small minds who would destroy knowledge out of fear. Not all within the Legion embraced this path. Some voiced concerns about the growing gulf between their practices and imperial sanction. Ravel Avida of the Corvidae approached his Primarch with respectful but firm objections, suggesting that perhaps the Emperor's cautions came not from ignorance, but from experiences beyond their understanding. As the controversies surrounding the Thousand Sons intensified, Magnus made a strategic decision. Rather than directly confronting their critics, the Legion would withdraw somewhat from the spotlight. They reduced their participation in major campaigns, instead focusing on specialized operations where their unique abilities could be employed with minimal oversight. Smaller detachments operating semi-independently allowed them to continue their work while attracting less attention. This partial retreat from prominence did little to quell the growing calls for sanction. If anything, the Thousand Sons' reduced visibility only fueled suspicions about what they might be doing beyond watchful eyes. Rumors spread of secret rituals conducted in the depths of their ships, of communion with entities from beyond reality, of experiments that blurred the line between human and something other. Some of these rumors contained kernels of truth. On the fifth planet of the Malachim system, a Thousand Sons detachment discovered a Priege of Strife library containing texts on warp navigation that went far beyond current imperial understanding. Rather than turning these documents over to the Mechanicum as regulations required, they secreted them away from Magnus' personal collection. Most concerning to Imperial authorities were the increasing reports of unidentified entities manifesting during Thousand Suns operations. Witnesses described ghostly presences that seemed to observe critical moments, shimmer briefly into visibility, then vanish when directly addressed. Magnus dismissed these accounts as misinterpretations of standard psychic phenomena, but privately he understood the concerning implications. The connections he had established with certain warp intelligences, beings he still believed to be benevolent knowledge seekers rather than the predatory entities the Emperor had warned of, were growing stronger. Sometimes they appeared unbidden, drawn by particularly powerful psychic workings. Their interest in the Legion's activities seemed to be intensifying, their influence becoming harder to disguise. The storm gathering around the Thousand Suns reached its height when Mortarion of the Death Guard formally petitioned the Emperor for an imperial inquiry into the Legion's practices. His pale features remained immobile as he presented his case before a gathering of Primarchs and high-ranking Imperial officials, but the passion behind his words was unmistakable. He spoke from deep concern for the Imperium's future. The Thousand Suns employed powers indistinguishable from those used by the tyrant sorcerers who had once enslaved his people. The petition gained immediate support from several quarters. Lemon Russ unsurprisingly added his voice to the call. More unexpected was the measured endorsement from Perdoabo of the Iron Warriors, who cited systemic accountability failures in the oversight of psychic practices. As word of the petition reached the Thousand Suns fleet, Magnus called his inner circle together for what would prove a fateful council. The Primarch's private stratagem was cleared of all recording devices, its entrance guarded by his most trusted warriors. Inside, the air hummed with tension as the Legion's highest-ranking officers gathered around the ancient crystal table that Magnus had brought from Prospero. Their time of relative freedom was coming to an end. The Emperor would soon render judgment on their Legion and their practices. At minimum, they faced severe restrictions on their psychic activities. At worst, the end of their Legion as they knew it. Magnus instructed his captains to comply with whatever formal investigation might be ordered. They would present their achievements, explain their methods, and defend their value to the Great Crusade with respect and transparency. Yet behind this public face of compliance, a different directive took shape. The knowledge they had gathered was too precious, too vital to humanity's future, to be sacrificed to momentary political expedience. Whatever restrictions might be imposed, their true work would continue beyond official scrutiny. The summons came without warning, carried by a golden ship that arrived in Prospero's orbit, heralding momentous change. The message it bore was simple. Magnus and representatives of his Legion were to travel to the distant world of Nika, where the Emperor would hear and judge concerns regarding the use of psychic powers within the estates. When Magnus gathered his captains to share the news, the chamber fell so silent they could hear the distant sounds of tiskas, fountains through the open windows. His expression remained composed, but those who knew him best could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the subtle tightening around his eye. The journey to Nea was long, giving Magnus ample time to prepare his defense. In his private chambers aboard the FOTEP, he spent hours in thought, occasionally dictating notes or reviewing ancient texts on psychic theory. These quiet moments held an intimate quality. A teacher and his most gifted students engaged in what might be their final intellectual collaboration. Necker itself seemed chosen for symbolic significance, a volatile world of shifting tectonic plates and unpredictable weather patterns. Its surface reflected the unstable nature of the powers being judged. Yet amid this geological turmoil stood a marvel of Imperial engineering, a vast amphitheater carved into the side of an ancient dormant volcano, its perfect acoustics ensuring that even a whisper from the central disk could be heard in the furthest tier. As the Thousand Suns vessels entered orbit, they joined a gathering unlike any seen since the earliest days of the Great Crusade. Ships from every legion hung against the darkness, their massive frames dwarfing the countless smaller vessels that carried representatives from across the Imperium. Mechanicum adepts, Imperial army commanders, administrators of compliant worlds, even civilian scholars and philosophers deemed worthy of witnessing this historic meeting. The amphitheater filled slowly over several days. The Thousand Suns, in their armor freshly polished for the occasion, were given seats that placed them directly across from the Space Wolves' contingent, an arrangement that felt less coincidental than deliberately provocative. Between these opposing forces sat representatives of every facet of Imperial society, their varied uniforms and regalia creating an image of humanity's reunified reach. Magnus's arrival silenced the amphitheater's constant murmur. Crimson King entered with dignified restraint, his presence drawing every eye despite his lack of ostentation. He wore simple robes over his armor, carrying only the Book of Magnus as both reference and symbol of his legion's collected wisdom. His single eye moved across the gathering, noting the positions of his brother Primarchs, Mortarian's polished frame, Layman Russ's barely contained energy, the Khn's inscrutable calm. What struck many observers was the lack of defiance in Magnus' demeanor. Where they had expected haughtiness or defensive pride, they saw instead the composed bearing of a scholar prepared to engage in reasoned debate. Those who had anticipated a confrontation between monsters instead found themselves watching something more human, a son preparing to justify his life's work before a father whose approval he still desperately desired. The proceedings began with formality, Malcador the Sigillite establishing the parameters of the debate. This was not about the Thousand Sons, he explained, but about the broader question of psychic powers within the estates, their use, their regulation, and their future within the Emperor's design for humanity. When his time came to speak, Magnus approached the central dais. The silence deepened as he began his defense, his rich voice filling the amphitheater without need for amplification. He spoke not of the Thousand Sons specifically, but of humanity's inherent psychic potential, a birthright that could not be denied, only channeled or suppressed. The heart of Magnus' argument lay in the inevitability of psychic awakening. The manifestation of these abilities across multiple legions proved he suggested that this was not an aberration, but an evolution the Emperor himself had anticipated. The Primarch drew on historical examples, scientific principles, and philosophical reasoning, building a case for controlled development rather than fearful rejection. Most compelling was his vision of a future where psychic ability became as natural to humanity as sight or hearing, a new sense to navigate an ever-expanding universe. He described with moving eloquence how such gifts, properly understood and mastered, could elevate the species beyond its current limitations toward a destiny worthy of the Emperor's grand design. In response came Mortarian, Lord of Death, his greedy voice somehow carrying despite its weakness. Where Magnus had offered hope and possibility, Mortarian brought warnings drawn from bitter experience. He spoke of his home world Barbarous, where psychic overlords had used their powers to enslave and torment the population. His testimony carried the weight of personal suffering, of having witnessed firsthand how the Imperium could corrupt even the most well-intentioned practitioners. The Master of the Death Guard drew no distinction between controlled psychic ability and sorcery. To him, they were merely different manifestations of the same fundamental corruption. The very connection to the warp that enabled these powers, he argued, inevitably led to degradation of both body and spirit. Allowing such practices within the legions would sow the seeds of humanity's eventual downfall. Layman Russ brought a different kind of opposition, more visceral, more instinctive, yet no less powerful for its lack of scholarly framing. The Wolf King spoke of witchcraft as an affront to honest warfare, a coward's path that circumvented the test of blade against blade, warrior against warrior. His arguments appealed to the martial pride that formed the backbone of Adi's identity. Throughout the hall, opinions shifted and solidified as other voices joined the debate. Advocates for the Liberius program cited documented battlefield successes, showing how controlled psychic abilities had saved Imperial lives and secured victories that might otherwise have been costly defeats. They pointed to the rigorous training protocols, the ethical frameworks, the careful monitoring that prevented misuse. One of the most nuanced arguments came from an unexpected quarter, a senior navigator whose ancient bloodline had served human vessels since before the Age of Strife. She drew careful distinctions between different types of psychic phenomena, highlighting how the Imperium already depended on sanctioned psykers like herself and the astropaths without whom interstellar communication would collapse. If these individuals could be safely employed, she reasoned, why not properly trained Astartes, whose transhuman nature offered additional safeguards? Throughout these arguments, the Emperor sat motionless upon the central throne, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Those nearest to him felt the weight of his attention as he absorbed every word, every nuance, evaluating not just the content of the arguments, but the character behind them. When Magnus made his final address, something had shifted in his demeanor. Perhaps sensing the direction of the gathering sentiment, he spoke with greater urgency, greater emotion. He reminded the assembly that knowledge suppressed did not cease to exist. It simply festered in darkness, denied the light of proper understanding. The choice before them was not whether psychic powers would manifest, but whether they would be met with wisdom or fear, with guidance or prohibition. As he concluded, many felt the Crimson King had made a compelling case. His eloquence, his evident sincerity, the rational foundation of his arguments, all seemed to have swayed significant portions of the gathering. Yet in the faces of those with the power to decide, Magnus saw something that caused his heart to sink, a resolution already formed, a judgment awaiting its formal declaration. The amphitheater fell into absolute silence as the Emperor rose from his throne. His presence seemed to expand until it filled the vast space completely. When he spoke, his voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. The Emperor acknowledged the concerns raised from all quarters. He recognized the valuable service that psykers provided to the Imperium, the necessity of their continued function in specific controlled roles. Yet his judgment fell with the weight upon the question of psychic powers within the Astartes legions. All use of psychic abilities by the Space Marines was to be prohibited, save for those specific functions deemed essential by Imperial authority. The laborious departments established across the legions would be disbanded immediately. Their members returned to conventional combat duties. Any further exploration of psychic techniques, any continued development of warp-based abilities, any research into the enhancement of such powers, all were explicitly forbidden. In place of the librarians would come a new officer corps, the chaplain, tasked with maintaining spiritual discipline and ensuring adherence to the Emperor's edicts. These warriors would serve as both moral guides and watchful guardians, identifying and reporting any resurgence of prohibited practices. The Emperor's gaze fell upon Magnus as he delivered the final portion of his judgment. The censure was public and unambiguous. The Crimson King had erred grievously in his advocacy for powers whose danger he had consistently underestimated. The Thousand Sons had pursued knowledge without sufficient caution, had developed abilities without adequate safeguards, had courted forces that threatened the very fabric of human existence. Most devastating was the Emperor's closing warning, a statement delivered with such terrible certainty that it seemed to echo in the amphitheater long after the words themselves had faded. Should Magnus or his legion continue their forbidden practices, should they defy this final edict, the consequence would be nothing less than their complete destruction. The Emperor would visit such annihilation upon them that their very name would be struck from imperial records for all time. The judgment fell upon Magnus like a physical strike. His posture seemed to diminish, his shoulders bearing the visible weight of this public rebuke. What hurt most was not the restriction itself, but the fundamental rejection it represented. A father declaring his son's life work not just misguided but dangerous, not just unnecessary but worthy of extinction. As the assembly dispersed, the Primarchs and their retinues returning to their vessels, Magnus moved as if in a dream. His sons gathered around him, their expressions reflecting the shock and disbelief they all shared. Everything they had built, everything they had believed in had been condemned with a finality that left no room for appeal. Back aboard the Fodep, Magnus retreated to his private chambers, refusing all visitors save Ammon. Those who passed his door in the hours that followed reported hearing no sound from within, no rage, no lamentation, only a silence more troubling than any outburst could have been. When Magnus finally emerged, his expression had settled into a mask of perfect compliance. He gathered his captains and issued new directives in accordance with the Emperor's decree. The Legion would return to Prospero. The Librarius would be disbanded. All psychic practices would cease immediately. The Thousand Sons would demonstrate their loyalty through absolute obedience. Yet those closest to Magnus noticed something in his single eye that gave them pause, a flicker of something beyond acceptance. It might have been defiance, or it might have been foreknowledge. Whatever its nature, it suggested that while the Council of Nia had rendered its judgment, the story of Magnus and his Thousand Sons was far from concluded. Sometime later, in the quiet solitude of his meditation chamber aboard the Fodep, Magnus sat cross-legged and perfectly still. The only light came from softly glowing crystals placed in a precise circular pattern around him, casting gentle shadows that danced on the walls. These private moments had become increasingly precious to the Crimson King since the Council of Nicaea. Here he could still commune with the currents of the great ocean in secret, finding solace in the familiar patterns of thought and energy that had defined his existence for so long. The vision came as a violent intrusion that shattered his careful meditative state. It began with a single drop of blood falling into still water, ripples expanding outward until they became waves, then a tempest. Magnus gasped as his consciousness was pulled into the maelstrom, his single eye wide with shock as images of unthinkable betrayal cascaded through his mind. There was Horus, beloved Horus, the war master and most trusted son, his noble features now twisted with cruelty, his armor adorned with symbols that hurt to look upon. Around him gathered warriors from multiple legions, their once proud heraldry defaced with similar markings. Magnus recognized them all. Sons of Angron, of Fulgrim, of Mortarion, of Perorabo. Brother legions now turned against their own. The scope of what Magnus witnessed left him trembling. This was no minor rebellion, no localized uprising. This was the sundering of the Imperium itself. Brother fighting brother across 1,000 worlds, civilization collapsing into chaos, the dream of unity shattered beyond recovery. He saw Imperial worlds burning, saw the golden aquilars torn down, saw atrocities committed by warriors who had once been the embodiment of humanity's noblest aspirations. Most terrible of all, he saw the final confrontation. The Emperor and Horus locked in combat, powers unleashed as father and son sought each other's destruction. The vision ended with blood and sorrow, with a wounded galaxy that might never heal from the scars of what was to come. When Magnus finally returned to full awareness, he found himself sprawled on the chamber floor, his copper skin drenched with sweat, his breathing ragged. Around him, the crystal meditation stones had shattered, unable to contain the psychic energies that had surged through the room. The Primarch pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet, his hands shaking with fear, not for himself, but for everything he and his father had worked to build. There was cruel irony in this moment of clarity. Magnus, whose precognitive abilities had allowed him to glimpse countless possible futures, found himself unable to perceive his own fate in the coming conflagration. The thread of his own destiny remained obscured, as if deliberately hidden from his sight by forces that understood all too well the power of knowledge and of its absence. In the aftermath of the vision, as Magnus paced his chambers with uncharacteristic agitation, the weight of responsibility settled upon his shoulders. He alone had seen what was coming. He alone could warn the Emperor before Horus's treachery came to fruition. Yet to do so would mean violating the most explicit prohibition laid upon him at Nicaea, the use of his psychic gifts. The choice before him seemed impossible: remain obedient and watch the Imperium fall, or disobey and risk his father's wrath. Yet in truth, there was no choice at all. Whatever the personal cost, whatever punishment might follow, Magnus could not remain silent while the dream of unity unraveled. The Emperor must be warned, and conventional means would be too slow. Only through a working of unprecedented power could they bridge the vast distance to terror in time. The path forward was clear, though the cost remained unknown. Under the light of Prospero's twin moons, 9 figures gathered in the highest chamber of Magnus' personal observatory. These were not just any sons of the Thousand Sons, they were the inner circle, those whose psychic gifts nearly rivaled their Primarch's own. Each had sworn their loyalty to Magnus after Nia. Each had continued their forbidden practices in secret. Each understood the magnitude of what they now undertook. The chamber had been prepared with exquisite care. Symbols of power adorned the floor in patterns so complex they seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Incense burned in 9 golden censers. The fragrant smoke-forming currents that mirrored the invisible flows of energy surrounding them. At the center stood a crystal focus of flawless clarity, its many facets designed to amplify and direct psychic energy across the impossible vastness of space. Magnus moved among his sons, touching each briefly on the shoulder, his expression determined. No words were exchanged. None were needed between those whose minds had been linked in psychic communion for decades. Each understood their role. Each recognized the risk they assumed. Should they fail, the consequences would be severe. Should they succeed, they might save the Imperium itself. As the alignment of stars reached its optimal position, Magnus took his place at the center of the chamber. His sons formed a perfect circle around him, each seated before one of the golden censers, their minds already beginning to synchronize through practiced techniques. Power built within the chamber, a pressure that made the air itself seem to thicken and shimmer with potential. The ritual began with a gentle pulse of energy that expanded outward from Magnus, etching each of his sons in turn. They responded in kind, creating a resonance that amplified their combined power. Layer upon layer of psychic energy accumulated, building toward a crescendo that would project Magnus' consciousness across the galaxy to terror itself. Yet as the working progressed, resistance became apparent. The distance was too vast, the barriers too formidable even for their combined might. Magnus' consciousness reached into the great ocean, seeking the currents that would carry him to his destination, but found them turbulent and unwelcoming. Something opposed his passage, forces he had not anticipated blocking the path to terror. It was in this moment of struggle, as the ritual teetered on the edge of failure, that Magnus sensed a presence watching from the depths of the Immaterium. Not hostile, not predatory, but curious and offering assistance. A tendril of power reached toward him, offering the strength needed to complete the working, to break through the barriers and deliver his warning. Magnus hesitated, some instinct warning him against accepting this anonymous aid, yet the urgency of his mission overwhelmed caution. The vision of Horus's betrayal still burned in his mind. The knowledge that every moment of delay brought the Imperium closer to catastrophe. He reached back toward the offering, accepting the power that flowed into him. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Power surged through Magnus and his sons, magnifying their working 100-fold. Where before they had struggled against the currents of the great ocean, now they commanded them. The psychic message launched across the galaxy with unstoppable force, hurtling toward terror with the urgency of Magnus' desperate warning. That very power proved disastrous. When Magnus' consciousness reached terror, it did not gently touch the outer barriers of the Imperial Palace as he had intended. Instead, it smashed through them with devastating force, shattering psychic wards and defenses the Emperor himself had established. Alarms screamed through the palace as reality itself was breached. allowing things from beyond to slip through the cracks. Deep beneath the palace, where the Emperor had been laboriously constructing a human extension into the webway, a project that would have freed mankind from dependence on warp travel, catastrophe unfolded. The barriers between real space and the Imperium ruptured, allowing demonic creatures to pour into the corridors. Custodians and Silent Sisters rushed to contain the incursion, while Mechanicum adepts died by the hundreds as their carefully maintained machinery overloaded or was torn apart. Through this chaos, Magnus delivered his warning directly into the Emperor's mind. A desperate, detailed account of Horus's corruption and the coming civil war. Every detail from his vision was laid bare, every betrayal named, every consequence foretold. Yet even as the message was delivered, Magnus became aware of the destruction his message had caused. Horror replaced urgency as he realized what his recklessness had done. As his consciousness snapped back to his physical body on Prospero, Magnus collapsed to the floor of the observatory, his sons similarly stricken around him. The chamber bore the marks of incredible energies, melted crystal, scorched stone, air that crackled with residual power. The physical damage pad compared to the knowledge burning in Magnus' mind. In his attempt to save the Imperium, he had done irreversible damage. On Terror, the Emperor stood in the devastation. The golden halls beneath the palace, once humming with the careful construction of humanity's future, now echoed with screams and weapons fire. Blood pooled on marble floors where Mechanicum adepts and custodians had fallen, their bodies torn apart by creatures that should never have entered real space. Smoke rose from ruined machinery representing centuries of irreplaceable work. The Emperor's rage was not the hot explosive anger of mortals, but something ancient and terrible, a cold fury that seemed to dim the very air around him. Those brave enough to glance at his face saw an expression of such terrible disappointment that they found themselves weeping without understanding why. This was not just anger at disobedience, but grief for a vision of humanity's future now lying in ruins. Magnus' warning about Horus, about betrayal and civil war, pressed against the Emperor's consciousness. Yet it could not penetrate the wall of justified wrath that rose in response to the catastrophe unfolding before him. All he could see in this moment was the willful arrogance that had led Magnus to shatter the most carefully constructed psychic defenses in the galaxy, to destroy the painstaking work on the Webway project, to unleash horrors upon loyal servants who had no defense against them. The warning itself became suspect through the means of its delivery. What better way for the powers of chaos to sow discord than to turn father against favored son through accusations of treachery? Magnus had reached deep into the great ocean to send his message. How could the Emperor trust that what returned was untainted by the very forces they had always feared? When Constantine Valdor, Captain General of the Custodian Guard, approached his master for instructions, the Emperor's decision was swift and absolute. Magnus must be brought to Terror to answer for his actions. The prohibition against sorcery had been clear, as were the consequences for violating it. The Emperor instructed that a fleet be assembled, led by Lemon Russ and his space wolves to travel to Prospero and apprehend Magnus. The order was clear. The Primarch of the Thousand Sons was to be captured and returned to Terror for judgment. His sons were to be contained, but not harmed unless they actively resisted. The Emperor still wished to hear Magnus' explanation directly, to understand what had driven him to such a catastrophic act of defiance. This message would never reach Layman Russ. As the orders traveled across the vast distances of space, they passed through the hands of one whose corruption Magnus had tried to warn against, Horus Lupercal, now secretly turned against his father. With subtle adjustments to the wording with implications inserted between carefully chosen phrases, the Wararm Master Raster transformed a command for arrest into a sanction for destruction. By the time Lemon Russ received the orders, he understood them as permission, even encouragement, to execute the Emperor's judgment upon a brother who had delved too deeply into forbidden knowledge. The censure fleet assembled quickly. Space wolves in their thousands, supported by elements of the Silent Sisterhood, whose null presence would neutralize the Thousand Sons' psychic abilities, and even a contingent of custodians to represent the Emperor's direct authority. Ships gathered in cold orbit, their weapons being checked and rechecked, their holds filled with warriors who believed they were carrying out the Emperor's will in its purest form. Among them, none questioned whether their mission had been perverted from its original intent. None wondered if they were being used as instruments in a scheme beyond their understanding. They prepared for war, certain of their righteousness, never suspecting they were taking the first steps toward the very civil conflict Magnus had tried to prevent. On Prospero, Magnus stood alone atop a tower of Tisca, his single eye gazing at stars that suddenly seemed cold and distant. The night wind tugged at his robes, carrying the sense of crystal gardens and incense from the temples below. His communion with the entity he had once thought an ally now revealed as Tzeentch, the changer of ways, had left him shaken to his core. The scales had fallen from his eye, allowing him to see with terrible clarity how thoroughly he had been manipulated. His warning, his desperation, his love for his father, all had been used as tools to achieve ends he had never intended. The truth was that his own pride had made him the perfect pawn. He had believed himself too clever to be deceived, too powerful to be used, too enlightened to fall into the traps that snared lesser minds. Now the consequences of that hubris were hurtling toward Prospero in the form of a fleet led by the one brother who had always warned against exactly this outcome. When Ammon found him still standing there as dawn broke, Magnus' decision was already made. There would be no defense, no resistance, no escape. He had seen the truth at last. He had been used to strike a blow against his father's work, used to create a breach that led horrors into the palace itself. Loyal servants of the Imperium had died because of his arrogance. The orders Magnus issued that day left his sons stunned and confused. The Legion fleet was to disperse immediately, traveling to distant corners of the galaxy on various missions that would keep them safely away from Prospero. The planet's defense systems were to be powered down, its weapons secured. Most bewildering of all, not a word of explanation was to be given to the rank and file. They would face the coming storm without understanding why their Primarch refused to raise a hand in defense. Only the innermost circle were granted the burden of knowing the full truth. They gathered in Magnus' private sanctum, their faces reflecting varying degrees of disbelief and resistance as he explained his decision. In the end, they obeyed, though it broke their hearts to do so. The Legion fleet departed, carrying thousands of sons away from the doom approaching their home world. Those who remained went about their duties with somber determination, preparing not for war, but for its aftermath. As for Prospero itself, its people continued their daily lives in blissful ignorance of what approached. Magnus cast a psychic veil over the entire world, a subtle working that redirected attention away from the approaching fleet, that soothed concerns and discouraged questions. It was perhaps his final act of compassion, allowing his adopted people one last interval of peace before the end. On the night before the wolves were due to arrive, Magnus returned to the highest tower. The city below glittered with lights, its silver spires reaching toward stars that would soon be obscured by the smoke of its burning. He could feel the weight of destiny settling around him, the threads of fate drawing tight. Whatever came next, he would face it clear-eyed and knowing that at the end, when it mattered most, he had chosen loyalty over survival. It was a choice the powers of the warp had never anticipated, and perhaps in that small defiance lay the seeds of a victory they could not comprehend. As darkness deepened over Prospero for the final time, Magnus the Red stood vigil for the city and people he had loved. Tomorrow would bring fire and death, judgment and destruction. His sons would fall. His works would burn, his dream of enlightenment would end in blood and ash. But in this moment, he found a strange peace. The deception that had haunted him since his bargain with Tzeentch held no more power over him. The pride that had blinded him to manipulation had been burned away by hard-won wisdom. Far below in the sleeping city, Ahriman stood at a window in the pyramid of Fodep, watching the distant figure of his Primarch silhouetted against the stars. Unlike the citizens around him, he knew what the dawn would bring. He knew that the city he loved, the Legion he had served, the Primarch who had saved him, all stood on the precipice of destruction. Yet despite the grief that threatened to overwhelm him, Ahriman felt something else stir within his breast, a fierce pride in Magnus' choice. Not pride in the mistakes that had led them here, but in the courage it took to face the consequences with open eyes and unbowed head. As the last stars wheeled overhead, Magnus remained at his post. Once the embodiment of humanity's potential for evolution and enlightenment, he now stood as a monument to a more fundamental truth. That wisdom sometimes comes too late, that the noblest intentions can pave roads to ruin. That love itself can become the instrument of destruction. The Space Wolf fleet slipped from the warp as a gathering of warships so vast they dimmed the light of Prospero's sun. At their heart loomed the massive shape of Layman Russ's flagship, a vessel that bore the scars of 100 campaigns. Surrounding it flew ships bearing the emblems of the Silent Sisterhood and the Custodian Guard, their golden hulls catching the first rays of daylight. In the ordinary course of events, such an arrival would have triggered immediate defensive protocols. Warning sirens would have sounded across the planet. Void shields would have flickered to life around population centers. The Thousand Suns fleet would have moved to intercept, or at least to hail the newcomers and determine their intent. But Prospero remained silent, defenseless, just as Magnus had ordered. Orbital defense platforms drifted lifelessly, their weapons cold and unpowered. The planetary shield grid showed nothing but diagnostic errors on unattended monitoring stations. The Thousand Suns fleet was conspicuously absent, dispatched to distant corners of the galaxy on missions that existed only in their Primarch's imagination. Even the regular patrols of Prosperine aircraft that would normally crisscross the skies above Tisca had been grounded for routine maintenance. As dawn's light crept across Tiscar's gleaming pyramids, the first salvo fell from the heavens. The Hafnal opened the bombardment, its massive weapon systems etching lines of burning light into Prospero's surface. Moments later, the rest of the Imperial fleet joined the assault, a rolling thunder of destruction that shook the very foundations of the planet. Where those weapons struck, paradise became inferno. Ancient forests that had been cultivated by prospering botanists for generations vanished in an instant, replaced by churning seas of flame. Research outposts and agricultural centers disappeared in blooms of light visible from orbit, the careful work of centuries undone in moments. Lives ended without warning or understanding. Only Tzeench itself remained largely untouched in those first terrible minutes, not through any mercy on the part of the attackers, but because of the sin shields projected by the raptor cult of the Thousand Suns. These telekinetic barriers, maintained by a handful of Magnus sons, who had not been privy to their Primarch's decision to accept destruction, shimmered invisibly above the city. Bombardment shells detonated harmlessly against the psychic dome, their fury spent without reaching the citizens below. Inside the shield, confusion flared. The peaceful routine of morning shattered as the ground trembled beneath their feet, and distant explosions painted the horizon in shades of fire. Citizens gathered in plazas and thoroughfares looking to each other for explanations none could provide. Many turned their eyes to the great pyramids where the Thousand Suns made their home, expecting guidance or at least information from their transhuman protectors. But the warriors seemed as bewildered as everyone else. Without orders, without explanation, they watched as their world burned around their island of temporary safety. Some reached out with their psychic senses, trying to understand the scale of what was happening beyond the shields, only to recoil in horror at the systematic annihilation unfolding across their planet. From his tower, Magnus watched it all with his single eye, silhouetted against the fire-stained sky. His expression remained composed despite the destruction visible in every direction. The countryside where he had walked with his adoptive father, Ammon, now lay scorched. The crystal forests where he had meditated on the nature of the great ocean, now reduced to fields of blackened stumps and molten glass. The settlements where humans had lived free from the fear of their psychic gifts, now little more than smoking craters. It was a desolation so complete, so methodical that it could only be born of genuine hatred or absolute conviction in the righteousness of the act. The space wolves had come to eradicate, not to capture, but to destroy. The planet that had dared harbor witches would be purged with the same zealous thoroughness the wolves brought to every campaign against humanity's enemies. As the bombardment continued, hour after merciless hour, the kind shields began to flicker. The psychic strain on the raptor cult members maintaining them grew harsher. Their bodies pushed beyond even their considerable limits. One by one, sections of the shield failed, allowing the devastation to reach into Tzeench itself. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed under direct hits. Gardens that had been the pride of the city disappeared in gouts of flame and debris. As the orbital bombardment slackened, a new terror descended from the skies. Drop pods and assault craft by the hundreds screamed through Prospero's atmosphere, their hulls glowing red with the friction of entry. The largest and most ornate of these craft, an enormous storm with steel gray sides and the image of twin wolves painted on its blunt prow, led the attack wave. The massive gunship smashed into the eastern quarter of the city, a district known as Old Tzeench, where the most ancient structures had been lovingly preserved as reminders of the colony's humble beginnings. The assault ramp dropped and Layman Russ himself set foot on Prospero, the first invader ever to do so. The Wolf King stood for a moment, surveying the destruction around him, his armor catching the light of fires that had already taken hold in the district. Two enormous Fenrisian wolves padded at his sides, their hackles raised at the unfamiliar sense of this world, soon to die. The space wolves, unleashed by their Primarch's wordless howl, swept through the streets of Tzeench. There was no careful advance, no securing of strategic positions, no attempt to minimize civilian casualties. This was the unrestrained fury of Fenris visited upon a world the wolves had been convinced deserved only annihilation. Against this onslaught stood the Prospero Spy Guard, the planet's human defenders, men and women who had trained diligently, but had never expected to face anything like the fury now directed at them. They were soldiers of an academic world, guardians of libraries and research facilities, not hardened veterans of the Great Crusade's bloodiest campaigns. Yet they stood their ground with remarkable courage. On the upper slopes of Old Tzeench, Captain Sakam Vithara of the 15th Prosperine Assault Infantry established a defensive line anchored between the fire-wreathed pyramid of the pirate cult and the Corvid cult's silver spire. His troops, though outmatched in every possible way, fought desperately in the southwestern quadrant. The Prospero assault pioneers rallied what remained of their forces after avalanches caused by the orbital bombardment had swallowed 3 of their barracks. The Northern Palatine Guard deployed on the edges of the burning port, occupying high parapets that overlooked the libraries and art galleries of the Nephrite district. Their commander, Captain Nefa, heir to one of Prospero's oldest families, displayed tactical acumen that would have earned commendation at any Imperial officer's column. He positioned his troops with careful attention to lines of fire and retreat paths, making brilliant use of the urban terrain to maximize the effectiveness of his limited forces. The wolves overran his position in very little time at all. Such was the pattern repeated across Tisca. Brave stands made by the spy guard, momentary rallies that might have seemed to offer hope, each snuffed out by the killers in gray. For all their courage and tactical skill, the mortal defenders of Prospero might as well have been trying to hold back the tide with their bare hands. As the space wolves pushed deeper into the city, they encountered a new form of resistance. Civilian militias, hastily armed with whatever weapons could be found, rose to defend their homes and cultural treasures. Scholars who had spent their lives in peaceful study now stood shoulder to shoulder with laborers and artists, their faces set as they prepared to sell their lives. In the Museum of Antiquities, a group of elderly curators barricaded the entrances with priceless sculptures, then took up positions behind display cases containing artifacts from Old Terror. When the wolves broke through, these academics fought, several managing to wound their attackers before being cut down. Most saddening were the schools where teachers gathered their students in central halls, forming rings around the children they had sworn to nurture and protect. Some sang the traditional songs of Prospero as the wolves approached. Others told stories of the colony's founding. The wolves killed them all. Through it all, the Thousand Sons remained largely absent from the fighting. Magnus' orders had been clear, if incomprehensible to most of his sons. They were to take no action against the invaders. They were to remain in their pyramids and watch as everything they had built was torn apart around them. For warriors bred for combat, indoctrinated with devotion to duty and trained in the arts of war for decades or centuries, this enforced inaction was a torture. They stood at windows high in their sanctums, watching the systematic destruction of their home, the slaughter of people they had sworn to protect, unable to intervene because their gene father had forbidden it. Some broke under the strain. Individual warriors or small groups unable to bear the weight of their impotence any longer defied Magnus' orders and entered the fray. They were quickly cut down, outnumbered, and isolated, their deaths changing nothing in the overall flow of the invasion. As the day wore on and the devastation spread to every quarter of the city, the pressure on the Thousand Sons grew unbearable. The psychic weight of so much death, of an entire civilization being extinguished around them, pressed against their enhanced senses. They could feel the terror of the dying, the pain of the wounded, the despair of those who realized their entire world was ending. And still, Magnus commanded in action. The breaking point came from raw emotion as a group of spy guard made their last stand before the pyramid of the Pavoni cult, desperately trying to evacuate civilians through a secondary entrance. Here, a pack of space wolves fell upon them. The defenders, already wounded from previous engagements, were cut down. The civilians, mostly families with young children, had nowhere to run. What happened next would be remembered differently by various witnesses, each colored by their own perspectives and prejudices. Some would claim it was a calculated decision, others a moment of uncontrollable rage. Whatever the truth, the Thousand Sons finally entered the battle. Captain Phos's Takar, watching from a high window as the wolves prepared to slaughter the defenseless civilians, felt something break inside him. With a psychic shout that cracked the crystal panes around him, he countermanded his Primarch's orders. The Pavon cult surged from their pyramid, their armor gleaming in the fires of the burning city. They did not engage the wolves with bolter and blade as one legion might normally fight another. Instead, they unleashed the full measure of their forbidden powers. The very abilities that had led to their censure at Nika. The air itself seemed to crack around them as they channeled energies from the great ocean, their eyes blazing with inner light, their hands weaving complex patterns that bent reality to their will. One Pavoni brother gestured toward a wolf pack, and their blood boiled within their veins, rupturing through even their enhanced biology in gouts of crimson steam. Another raised both hands to the sky, and lightning answered his call, striking from a cloudless heaven to reduce 3 wolves to charred husks within their armor. A third seemed to shimmer and divide, creating perfect duplicates of himself that confused and disoriented the enemy before each exploded in a burst of warp energy. It was exactly what the space wolves had always feared. The sudden intervention of the Thousand Sons spread across the city like wildfire. In pyramid after pyramid, Magnus' sons cast aside their restraint and entered the battle with the full measure of their psychic might. The tide began to turn, if not toward victory, then at least toward a more equal contest. In the Plaza of Reflection, Ahriman himself led a counterattack that drove deep into the Space Wolves' lines. His mastery of the great oceans surpassed almost all his brothers. And under his direction, the combined powers of the Corvidae and Oncults worked terrible havoc among the invaders. Wolves found themselves unable to trust their senses as illusions overlaid reality. Others fell into catatonia as their minds were crushed by telepathic assaults. Still others simply disintegrated, their molecular structure unbound. For a brief glorious moment, it seemed the Thousand Suns might at least secure some portion of their city, might save some fragment of prospering civilization from the jaws of annihilation. The civilians they had managed to gather behind their lines began to hope that survival might be possible after all. Then came the Sisters of Silence. They appeared like ghosts from the smoke of burning buildings, their gold and black armor reflecting the fires around them. They uttered no battle cries, made no dramatic gestures. They simply advanced, their presence creating expanding zones of psychic nullification that spread across the battlefield. The effect on the Thousand Suns was devastating. Where the sisters passed, psychic abilities faltered and died. The invisible forces the warriors had been manipulating suddenly vanished, leaving them disoriented and vulnerable. Spells collapsed mid-formation, sometimes backlashing against their casters. Levitating objects fell from the sky. Intricate illusions dissolved. Protective barriers winked out of existence. Magnus' sons found themselves forced back to conventional warfare, a domain where the expertise of the Space Wolves gave them an overwhelming advantage. Caught between the sisters' null fields and the resurgent fury of Russ's warriors, the Thousand Suns began to fall in greater numbers. The advance that had briefly offered hope became a fighting retreat. The Pavoni cult was nearly wiped out trying to hold a crucial intersection that would have allowed more civilians to escape. The Raptor cult expended the last of their strength maintaining shields around the groups they had managed to save. Even as their own bodies failed under the strain, the Pier fought a desperate rearguard action, using what remained of their powers to create walls of flame that briefly slowed the wolves' pursuit. Everywhere across Tisca, the pattern was the same. Initial success as sorceress powers caught the wolves by surprise, followed by collapse as the Sisters of Silence methodically negated those same abilities. What had begun as defiance became desperation, and what had been desperation soon became despair. In their moment of greatest need, the Thousand Suns called out psychically to their Primarch. Their plea carried all the anguish of sons watching their father's life work destroyed, all the desperation of warriors facing annihilation, all the confusion of children unable to understand why their parent would let this happen. From his tower, Magnus finally stirred. Magnus the Red descended from his sanctum like a god stepping down from Olympus. He seemed to shimmer with barely contained energies, the air around him distorting as reality struggled to accommodate his presence. Where he passed, the fighting momentarily ceased. Warriors of both sides struck silent by the sheer majesty and terror of what they saw. This was not the scholar Primarch many remembered from before Nicaea. This was a being of barely restrained power, his copper skin crackling with psychic energy, his single eye blazing with an inner light that hurt to look upon directly. The book that had always accompanied him was gone, replaced by a bladed staff that threw off arcs of lightning with each step he took. As Magnus strode through the burning ruins of his city, the remaining Thousand Suns rallied to him. They formed a loose phalanx behind their Genefather, their battered armor and exhausted expressions contrasting sharply with the Primarch's magnificence. Together they advanced toward where the Space Wolves had established their primary landing zone, where the greatest concentration of enemy forces awaited, and at their center stood Layman Raz. The Wolf King had removed his helmet, his wild man of hair blowing in the hot winds generated by the city's burning. His face was spattered with blood, some of it his enemies', some his own, and his armor bore the marks of the day's combat. At his side hung the massive Frostblade Mina, its edge glinting with ice crystals despite the inferno around it. The two Primarchs faced each other across a plaza once known for its beautiful fountains, now reduced to rubble and ash. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they simply regarded one another. 10,000 unspoken words passed between them in that gaze. Accusations and justifications, rage and sorrow. The weight of brotherhood twisted into enmity. Then with a howl, Russ charged. The battle was a clash of elemental forces. Where Magnus gestured, reality itself tore open, unleashing energies that could reduce tanks to molten slag. Where Russ struck, his blade moved with such speed that it seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. Around them, their sons continued their own desperate struggle. The remaining Thousand Suns threw every last scrap of their power into the fight. Knowing that this was likely the end, the Space Wolves pressed their advantage with redoubled fury. Sensing victory within their grasp, Sisters of Silence moved through the battlefield, their null auras creating zones where Magnus' sons found themselves stripped of their greatest weapons. The duel between Primarchs spread across what remained of Tisca. Buildings already weakened by bombardment collapsed as they crashed through walls. Statues that had stood for centuries were reduced to powder beneath their feet. The very ground cracked and heaved as Magnus Tzeentch powers that should never have been unleashed in the material realm. For a time, it seemed the Crimson King might prevail through sheer psychic might. His powers, no longer restrained by any pretense of imperial compliance, reached levels that terrified even his own sons. Russ was driven back step by step, his armor blackened by energies that would have vaporized a normal man. His legendary endurance tested to its absolute limits, but the Wolf King had not come unprepared. As Magnus unleashed a particularly devastating assault, a squad of Sisters of Silence moved into position behind him. Their combined null field created a moment of psychic blindness that the Crimson King had never experienced, a sudden severing from the great ocean that had always been his source of strength. In that instant of vulnerability, Russ struck. Minar found its mark with unerring precision. Driven by all the considerable strength the Wolf King could manage, the blade bit deep into Magnus' chest, shattering his breastplate and sending a spray of coppery blood across the ruined plaza. Before the Crimson King could recover, Russ followed with a series of blows. Magnus reeled backward, genuine pain registering on his features for the first time. His psychic defenses, disrupted by the Sisters' presence, failed to deflect physical attacks that would have normally never reached him. Blood, actual physical blood, not the symbolic ichor of a being transcending mortality, flowed from multiple wounds. The final moments came quickly. Russ barreled into his brother, wrapping his arms around Magnus' waist in a wrestler's hold. With a roar, the Wolf King lifted his brother high above his head. For a heartbeat, Magnus hung suspended against the smoke-darkened sky, a fallen god about to be cast down. Then Russ brought him down across his knee. The sound of the Crimson King's back breaking tore through the heart of every Thousand Sons estates. It was the audible shattering of everything they had believed in, everything they had fought for, everything they had become. Magnus lay broken upon the ground, twisted and ruined. His eye that had seen so far into the great ocean and pierced so many veils of reality, now focused with difficulty on his brother standing over him. Russ raised me, preparing to deliver the final stroke that would end the Crimson King forever. In that moment of extremity, with death just heartbeats away, Magnus reached deep into reserves of power he had never before accessed. Not for himself, his acceptance of punishment remained intact even now. But for his sons who had never understood the necessity of this sacrifice, who deserved some chance at survival, even if he did not. As Russ's blade swept down, Magnus whispered words of power, a spell of unmaking and translation, of dissolution and reformation. His physical body began to unmake itself, transforming into pure energy. Even as Malna cut through the space where his neck had been, the power released in that moment shot outward across Tiska, enveloping the remaining Thousand Sons and what few civilians they had managed to protect. Aemon, standing nearby, felt a vast and depthless power surge into his body. In that instant of connection, he understood what was required of him. His hands moved to the jade scarab set in his breastplate, the crystal that every Ardes of the Thousand Sons wore. As Magnus' form dissolved completely, Acrian channeled the immense energies flowing through him into this focus, and threw it to every surviving son of Magnus. Reality tore open, not in the familiar patterns of a controlled warp portal, but in a wild, desperate rending of the veil between dimensions. The remaining structures of Tiska, its pyramids, its libraries, its very foundations were uprooted from Prospero and hurled through this impossible opening, carrying with them the surviving Thousand Sons and whatever fragments of their civilization they had managed to save. Their destination was chosen out of necessity, a demon world deep within the Eye of Terror, a place prepared by the same entity that had manipulated Magnus from the beginning. Sortarius, the planet of the sorcerers, became their new home, a place where they could preserve what remained of their knowledge and traditions, but at a cost none of them yet understood. As the tear in reality sealed itself, leaving Russ standing in the ashes of what had once been Tisker, the Wolf King raised his head and howled. The space wolves completed their cleansing of Prospero, hunting down any survivors who might have escaped the initial assault. By nightfall, nothing lived upon the planet's surface save the invaders themselves. The city that had been a beacon of learning and culture was now nothing but smoking ruins. Its libraries burned, its art destroyed, its people exterminated. In orbit, the Imperial fleet prepared to depart, their mission accomplished. Prospero had been cleansed, the Emperor's will enforced, reports would be filed, casualties counted, equipment repaired. The machinery of Imperial compliance would grind on, recording this as one more world brought to heel. But for the Thousand Sons, scattered and transformed by their Primarch's final gift, the Burning of Prospero was a beginning of exile, of transformation, of a 10,000-year journey into realms of knowledge and power their past selves could scarcely have imagined. A journey that would lead them further and further from the light of the Imperium, deeper into the embrace of forces they once thought to master. The dream of enlightenment had died in fire and betrayal, but from its ashes would rise something new, something that would haunt the Imperium of man until the very stars grew cold. Time passes differently in the warp. What felt like moments for Magnus stretched into centuries for the material universe. As the Imperium descended into 10,000 years of superstition, and and decay following the Horus heresy, the Crimson King watched from his tower on the planet of the sorcerers, his single eye seeing far beyond the swirling madness of the Eye of Terror. Through those long millennia, one wound festered above all others, the burning of Prospero, the memory of his beautiful world reduced to ash, his people slaughtered, his sons scattered across the stars. These images never dimmed, never lost their power to evoke both sorrow and rage. And at the center of those memories stood Layman Russ, the Emperor's executioner, the brother who had broken Magnus' physical form and scattered his dream of enlightenment to the winds. The need for vengeance became a constant presence that whispered to Magnus during his long studies in the shifting towers of Saushirius. The space wolves would pay. They would know loss as he had known it, would feel their certainty crumble as his had. The plan took shape slowly, carefully, a working more subtle and far-reaching than any Magnus had attempted before. In the 32nd millennium, Great Wolf Herrick Ironhelm led the Space Wolves chapter. A warrior of stubbornness and pride, Ironhelm became fixated on the threat posed by the Thousand Suns. His dreams were haunted by visions of the Crimson King, striding through the smoking remains of conquered cities, taunting him from beyond the veil of reality. These nightmares drove Ironhelm to mount expedition after expedition, hunting for the Thousand Suns' hidden strongholds, determined to finish what Layman Russ had begun millennia before. Magnus watched these futile searches with cold amusement, deliberately leaving clues that led nowhere, drawing the Space Wolves farther from their fortress monastery with each passing year. Ironhelm's obsession grew, his judgment clouded by hatred and frustration. He became exactly what Magnus needed, a predictable enemy, one whose rage could be channeled and directed. The trap was finally baited at Gengava, a world near the edge of the Eye of Terror. Magnus allowed whispers to reach the Space Wolves that the Thousand Suns had established a secret base there, a foothold in real space from which they launched their sorcerous workings. The information came through seemingly unrelated sources, a captured cultist here, an intercepted astropathic message there. Each fragment confirming the others until the evidence seemed undeniable. Ironhelm gathered much of the chapter's strength and launched a full-scale assault on Gengava. The Space Wolves purged the Chaos cultists who had indeed taken residence there. They found evidence that seemed to confirm their suspicions, artifacts bearing the symbol of the Thousand Suns, chambers designed for rituals, even captured mutants who spoke of serving the Cyclops King. As the Space Wolves celebrated the deceptive symphony of Magnus, the Red's vengeance reached its orchestrated crescendo, not in the boisterous halls of Gengava, where the Space Wolves roared their apparent triumph, glutting themselves on the spoils of a battle he'd orchestrated for their consumption, but in the frozen, sacred silence of Fenris itself. Those warriors they had obliterated, whose broken bodies littered Gengava's plains, were mere pawns, willingly sacrificed rot morsels to lure the bulk of the chapter's ferocious strength far from their vulnerable heart. With the Sons of Rus committed to slaughtering illusions, Fenris lay naked beneath the cold stars. And from those stars, tearing through the veil of reality with a shriek of tormented warpspawn, the Thousand Suns fleet manifested directly above the cradle world of their most hated foes. At its terrible apex stood Magnus, no longer merely Primarch, but a being suffused with the raw stuff of chaos, his once noble copper skin, now a flowing tapestry of living warp energy, his single cyclopean, eye a boiling vortex containing swirling galaxies of ancient malice. Beside him, his mightiest sorcerers pulsed with forbidden power, and below, upon Fenris's icy skin, landed wave upon implacable wave of rubrici ornate, silent automatons, animated suits of ceramite filled only with dust and the echoes of screams, bound spirits puppeted towards the monolithic fang. The assault exploded without preamble, shattering the primordial quiet. Ancient void shields surrounding the Space Wolves' fortress monastery flared into shimmering agony as bombardment cannons spat apocalyptic fury from orbit like vengeful gods punishing a blasphemer. Gleaming dropships, obsidian scarabs against the blinding white, settled onto the lower slopes, disgorging the relentless rubrici tides. Advancing through snowdrifts taller than mortal men, their elaborate crimson and gold armor glittered grotesquely against the stark, pure landscape, a bloodstain spreading across virgin parchment. Thus began 40 days and 40 nights of siege, a grinding permutation of ice, fire, and despair. The skeleton garrison of Space Wolves, warriors who had remained on Fenris, fought with a courage born of utter desperation. They yielded ground inch by frozen inch, retreating deeper into the Fang's labyrinthine gut, collapsing caverns and sealing bulkheads with demolitions timed to the last microsecond, their flanks brushing ice-caked rock as they slowed but could not halt the silent, soul-dead advance. From the depths of millennia-long slumber, stirred by klaxons that screamed of the Fang's mortal peril, they awakened Bjorn the Fell-Handed. The Dreadnought's adamantium coffin pulsed with ancient awareness, his wisdom forged in the fires of countless wars flooding through stasis-lined canisters. His guttural binaric commands, delivered through a voice synthesizer thick with ages, became the iron spine of the defense, organizing the terrified, enraged young bloods into a semblance of disciplined resistance, a grim puppeteer pulling the strings of courage where all seemed lost. Yet Fenris was not entirely sealed. Through some hidden warpweb sallyport, a desperate clutch of scout marines, lean ghosts led by the keened Haken Blackwing, slipped through the cordon of Rubric and sorceress wards. They commandeered a latent ship, its engines groaning under desperate pushes, and plunged headlong into the turbulent Imperium, bearing horrific tidings to Gangava. The news struck Herrick Ironhelm like a physical blow to the gut. Standing amidst the cloying stench of stale victory beer and charred Xeno's flesh, the great wolf felt the crushing weight of his own arrogance, his pride exploited as surely as any blunt instrument. His homeworld, the sanctum sanctorum of their lineage, lay bleeding while he'd been chasing phantoms. Shame curdled into a furnace blast of icy fury that froze the marrow of his warriors. The return voyage to Fenris became an extended torment for Ironhelm, cramped within the stratagem of his flagship, his mind conjuring increasingly horrific visions of defilement upon every passing void mark. What iconoclasm was Magnus wreaking upon the shrines? What sacrilege upon the mountain? He drove his armada beyond sane limits, engines screaming past critical heat tolerances, navigators weeping blood as they forced improbable shortcuts through the turbulent immaterium, each fractured moment stretching into an eternity of imagined ruination. The Fenris that welcomed Ironhelm's fleet back was a scarred nightmare. The lower reaches of the Fang hospices, training arenas, ancient halls of remembrance were heaps of steaming rubble, littered with shell casings the size of bolters and twisted monuments to annihilation. The pervasive stench of ozone-scorched ceramite mingled horrifically with the copper tang of spilled Fenrisian blood. The sacred snow for leagues around had been scoured away entirely, melted to black slurry by the unnatural heat of warpfire and massed weapons discharge, revealing the obsidian bedrock like bones protruding from an unhealable wound. Dropships screamed from the space wolves' fleet immediately, vomiting fresh warriors clad in the mottled gray of Fenris into a meat-grinder counterattack. Ironhelm led the brutal advance personally, his storm shield a weatherfront of relentless negativity, gathering into a storm of focused annihilation. His cracked frostblade sang a keening dirge through the air as he carved a crimson path through the invaders occupying his ancestral home. Rubric exploded into dust clouds under his blows, sorcerers reeled as their psychic shields buckled under the sheer weight of his wrath. But his singular purpose distorted the battlefield around him. He sought only Magnus, seeking oblivion or vengeance, his vision narrowed to the Crimson King's terrible presence. Their clash finally erupted amidst the howling shriek of a Fenrisian blizzard high on the Fang's crippled slopes, wind screaming like the souls of the damned. The battle was fierce, a hurricane of violence contained between two titanic figures. Ironhelm fought with the skill of a master warrior and the fury of a betrayed patriarch, blows that would have leveled mountains raining upon the demigod. Yet he was but a space marine, however exalted, facing the fractured reflection of a god touched by the deepest arcane circles. Magnus, an ocean of power contained in monstrous flesh, endured the assault like weathering gnats. Ironhelm's attacks glanced off shields woven from nightmare logic or sank into paradox skin that reshaped itself. There was contempt in the Crimson King's movements then, a predator toying with prey trapped inside the larder box. With a gesture that seemed almost lazy, a wave of pure metaphysical force erupted from Magnus, cracking Ironhelm's storied power armor like spun glass, pulping transhuman organs within. The great wolf's broken body was cast down into the grasping drifts, a crimson smear against pristine white, a final, silent message carved in bone to bleed out meaning for his successor. As the surviving space wolves howled their agony over their fallen king, preparing for a doomed, glorious final stand within the Fang's deepest sanctums, a baffling phenomenon halted the slaughter. Magnus, seemingly on the cusp of absolute triumph, abruptly sounded the retreat. The silent Rubric turned and marched with mechanical precision back to their waiting landers. Sorcerers vanished in sudden bursts of unstable starlight. Confusion rippled through both forces, the space wolves bewildered by this apparent mercy, the Thousand Suns doubtless questioning a victory snatched away. Only the Crimson King, his gaze piercing the veil of frozen stone and mortal perception, understood the silent victory already achieved within the Fang's forbidden heart. For even as blades clashed and warpfire melted glaciers, Magnus himself had slipped unseen through veils of distraction only his mind could see. He passed through corridors etched with protective runes older than the Imperium, bypassing sacrosanct wards with the casual expertise of one who had walked these paths in less destructive times, penetrating chambers hallowed and hidden, the Gene Labs. Here, beneath tons of sacred rock, guarded by tradition and reverence more than mere bolter points, resided the genetic legacy of Lemon Russ himself. Here the complex alchemy transforming aspirants into ascendant nephews of the great Wolf King resided within shimmering reagent jars and humming fab generators grown nimbus from scrapcode scatter. Magnus came not to conquer, but to poison the wellspring. He unleashed his awful power not in destruction, but in defilement. The cryotanks holding developing husked organs burst apart, seeding the sterile floors with monstrous parasitic fluids. Arcane mechanisms, knowledge painstakingly recovered fragment by fragment from the unification era, melted into unrecognizable slag heaps, or transmuted into cold sculpted glass or screaming flowers of frozen venom. And worst of all, the priceless repository of pure genocide, carefully curated genetic chains chained across 10,000 years of history, stored in vacuum-sealed crypts numinous with stasis mist as chill as death itself. These shimmering stages of potential essence Magnus touched deliberately with the slashing psychic claws of purest Tzeentch Rebellion corruption. He rendered them unstable, misfiring genome chaos mines, waiting to detonate within the bodies of future generations. Yet the singular wound transcended ruin. The murder of the wolf priest Krayer, ambushed within his sanctum, his immense knowledge arcanotech cryptology understanding the unique serpent complexity and degeneration tendencies of the space wolves genocide, research yielding tantalizing glimpses into stabilization protocols, the very key to unlocking successor chapters extinguished in a blast of sorcerous fire, his forbidden libraries turned to ash mountains. His analytical nodules dissolved into psychic plasma puddles soaking into the deck plates. His death echoed with a finality no bolter blast could convey. Without Krayer's genius, without the intact genetic blueprints, the Space Wolves' legacy was amputated, their potential eternally capped at a single, dwindling chapter, inheritors of a curse predetermined vulnerability, perpetually walking the precipice of extinction. When Magnus gazed upon the receding fang from his flagship's viewport, snow erstwhile frosting the porthole framing its brutalist grandeur, it wasn't fiery victory that settled over his consciousness like ash. It was a cold, profound satisfaction, deep as the trenches between stars. The wolves would count their survival as Pyrrhic triumph they had paid steeply in blood and stone. They would rebuild their shattered bastion, grieve their honored dead, elect a new great wolf to roar ferocious promises of retribution, whispered only as comfort against bitter despair. Meanwhile, the invisible rot burrowed deep into their collective soul, a subtle corruption woven directly into their nascent progenade core, a genetic wound no surgeon's knife nor rune priest's incantation could ever truly cauterize. Magnus's vengeance against the vigors of Russ wasn't annihilation, a brutal snap ending told swiftly for trivial oblivion. It was exquisite surgical malice, knowing he had condemned his most hated foes to slow, irreversible bacterial decay, gnawing tirelessly on the very roots of their future strength. They would persist, even thrive in some savage outbreaks of glory, but always diminished in potential. A magnificent predator forever hobbled, its roar still thunderous yet robbed of the ability to truly terrify the galaxy sky once saturated with its potential. In the years bleeding towards the Cicatrix Maledictum's cataclysmic advent, around the darkening steep gradient signifier steps of M41's closing epoch, Magnus began assembling tactical pieces across the Imperium's rotting chessboard. The nuanced sarcasm tenderness of subtle manipulations and hidden proxies felt pale premonitions of cosmic ice settling. He declawed long enough at shadows. The Crimson King felt the throbbing beat of destiny resonate deep within his melted warp-touched bones. Now was the moment to thrust his entire terrible presence, unmasked and resplendent in treachery's magnificence, into the decaying substance of reality, unleashing revenge carefully nurtured across 10,000 wounded years. No intricate lure would suffice, only orchestrated, galaxy-spanning bedlam would cloak his true design. His preparatory rituals screamed of omnicidal ambition, fed on centuries of accumulated hate-compiled intelligence about Fenrisian defenses. Space wolf tactics spun into tactical trapwebs, woven with cunning, woven beyond mortal capacity. Across a dozen threatened sectors, meticulously coordinated diversionary attacks erupted Orc-Wags. Spurred into frenzy by carefully planted murmurs, Tyranid splinter fleets drawn towards tempting biomass-rich worlds moments after inexplicable incidents degraded planetary defenses, Necron tomb worlds unnervingly stirring from ionic slumber amid signals bearing strange alpha-coding recursion echoes. Each crisis sucked Imperial resources bone-pulp dry, forcing the monolithic war machine into impossible strategic stretching exercises until operational tendons screamed. Simultaneously, his psychic presence, a stain bleeding across the Imperium unseen by crude astrotelemetry, concerned only with gross mass displacement signatures, subtly twisted the frenetic warp tides swirling specifically around the Fenris subsector, rendering astropathic communication distorted nonsense choked with Empyrean static screaming, despair translated falsely as localized conflict reports. The most insidious thread woven into this imbroglio meta-strategic tapestry was the Changeling, a dissolute horror form of Tzeentch imagined incarnate, its mastery of mimicry and perception poisoning unmatched. Dispatched as Magnus's plague vector, this protean infiltrator insinuated itself deep into labyrinthine Imperial command systems administratum scola casements secured via hacked noospheric data pseudopods, sector commands VoxNet nodes replaced with whispering replicant lice machines. It weaponized misinformation, wholesale selling twisted images of Space Wolves patrols attacking Imperial Guard convoys under Falsicolor Company banners, fabricating clandestine whispers of secret pacts forged with alien entities under glacial caverns, splintering trust with paranoid insinuation, engineered to fracture millennia of battlefield camaraderie. Suspicion metastasized within the heart of the Imperium, where the throne once dispensed brotherhood denied. Calls for aid sent sluggishly from Fenris warships bleeding void fluid over Vox channels, thick with distortion, broadcast from some clogged Imperial vein reluctantly moving reinforcements, met with hesitation, paranoid cross-questioning from fleet commanders reluctant to divert scarce resources to possibly traitorous recipients suspected by impeccably timetabled falsities meticulously seeded. Traditional shield brethren of the Space Wolves, navigated generations by oath-spilled blood contracts thicker than parchment created in forgifiers of mutual struggle, now eyed Fenrisian hololith messengers with the distrust reserved for newly uncovered cultist agents, hands hovering over worn leather-bound holster slaps securing grim stubby execution pistols, while voxing requests for additional verification protocols etched on suspicion's brittle lens. Thus began a campaign that trapped the Space Wolves in Freya's anarchic chopping sphere, a hydrameth onslaught of simultaneous catastrophes, savaging every point across their native system, with teeth formed of malignant sorcery, and wet dripping blades edged on despair. Cultist uprisings erupted like septic boils upon the surface of Cursupt, martyring fanatic servants of the Changer before defenses could be repositioned. Portals torn rent in reality's skin by joint sorcerer conclave numerology spat legions of screamers onto icy Hrothgar, where rune priests battled twisted physics beneath hunting moons shedding sudden unnatural light. Thunderhawks were swatted from grim Fenrisian skies by direct assault from translucent Azure Thousand Suns vessels, arriving with impossible coordinated precision. Led by the beleaguered Colossus Logan Grimnar, the weathered Great Wolf who had seen empires attempt genocide scream, articulated his defiance from bridge reports cracked like webbed eggshells etching sorrow onto his eternally fierce countenance. He hurled his sons into the blackening firestorm with indefatigable fury nonetheless. Drop pods and Stormfang gunships became screaming meteors, plunging corrosive trails directly into cultist hellscapes, erupting ironbrown with cordite stains spreading. Pack's armored figures moved relentlessly as glacier melt tourism slaughter lines through wrecked habitation clusters submerged in ice-choked lava fields twice frozen over. Ancient gray armor scarred by claws, yet bolters barked thunderclap denial against constellations of sorcerous aberrations, turning pink snow crystalline abruptly to hyper-accelerated timelines. Dust exploded elderly bodies facing impossible distortions flickering rhino-sized projections, multiplying illusory across ruined avenues, bringing bolter salvos slice thin nothingness engaging clever enemies thrive confusion, reserves tactical meta-shaping battlefield. Ancient dreadnoughts blazed chainfists slow advancing alongside packs, whose youthful enthusiasm momentarily became weaponized against conceptual horrors, coalescing unpredictably spawned lore disturbance fields at precise nape root cohesion failure points. Yet courage slammed against sorcerous barriers, thrown far exceeding mere mortal comprehension spheres. Magnus's millennia steeped exile within the Met-Warp Tudor laboratories, where physics whimpered under existential strangulation, attempts psychological confidence manipulation, attempts failed utterly against Wolfbrain return imperative feedback, loops ignoring absurd sensory pollution, had unpacked chains binding his innate primordial consciousness uncounterbalanced ethical restraint architecture, signaling horror elsewhere. Though for the Wolves, their doom manifested as hyper-reality, shattering concussive waves rolled forward, without warning reducing armored platoons to flesh shrapnel confetti, decorated with spurting molten ceramite droplets, dripping grotesquely atop ruins already semi-molted by secondary phenomena, creating glaciared wilderness reflecting discord spacetime tears. Void shield generators arrayed around vital positions, imploded accelerated cancerous entropy radiation bubbles, hypnotized crews wandered platforms, transformed dreamwalking quays of automatons, before nanosecond collapsing into swirling vortex residues, inviting patient clinical warfare epistemology, considering least countermeasure aggressive strategic engagement flexibility. Assault ram sections peeled open, exposing precious Astartes organ sacs necessary for continued consciousness integration, disassembling entire command squads faster than defensive responses, could synapse through cauterization burning synapses, transmitting conclusions, arrived always too late understanding patterns, emerging sheer ruin beyond tactical intervention. The ultimate salient crowded onto the ice plains cradling Asaheim's foothills nearing the Fang's east face, ablaze distress flakdrones still circling feudal seeking vectors, arrowed towards menace instantiation pocket, gathering intensity, becoming singularity punctuation, discarding pawns advancing towards crucial conclusion. There, scarred by unnatural scorch marks, scarring the permanent glaciers like branding iron wounds. Logan Grimnar alone faced the manifestation of his chapter's original sin, standing manifest reality, as Magnus dropped localized reality perturbation bubble, separating classical physics interpretation of blood-soaked snow, losing substance crystal moments shifting towards unfelt causality dust, becoming periphery observer distortion, anchored complicated ritual shapes thickening atmospheric overlay noospheric fragmentation signals. Grimnar charged overhead Moray held grasping frozen handle vibrating hull clanging planetary descant, harmonizing with universe repair lullabies. The ancient axe, its blade steeped incalculably in centuries' triumphs against chaos rage backflows darkening untrusted borderland conflicts waged against impossible foes, flung beyond galaxy-governing logic circuits, became purity anthem conductor held aloft. Flared ice-white ceremony, awakening ancestral material communion ritual skein, potentially capable of severing Tzeentch's phosphorescent manifold touch dancing within Magnus's very cellular architecture existence. Lattice prototype, a cold crucible attempting suddenly dim possibility, held suspended unreal temporal tierline history, pause button breathing unseeable outlines against the storm's throat baby fur, stripped instantly by Arctic bite railing molecule distant headaches, absent palpable. Enthusiastic engagement eigenvectors twisting improbable arcs towards temporary reality cables. For one choking inhalation of Fenrisian wind screaming, despair confetti swirling vortex patterns, abruptly defining an arena where hope flinched briefly peaked potential lethality, physically demonstrated, Moray actually connected. Not metaphysically imploded upon metaphorical field discipline, shielding territory, imagined painlessly dissipating, the Blocolonotans effortlessly recalled earlier displays, leaving sentimental conclusions, untested raw paradoxical interaction mathematics. The fractal razor edge bit deep into Magnus's transformed illusory epidermis, as though briefly piercing dense vapor fog palette, reflecting Gulf Stream signatures elsewhere, still feeling yielding resistance unmistakable ache familiar, causing actual somatic wound muscle feedback tricks, indistinguishable flesh armor, recurring symbolic grievance, now unexpressed anger, could not rewrite established scale definitions of possibility, regardless heroic attempt force density vectored execution. The blinding flash retina preservation, aura contracted hamster spasms, cancelled spectrums, swirling emergency flatlining exposure, recalled seconds. The shock traveled deep vibration back through the weapon into Grimnar's clenched, augmented forearm assembly as the Primarch demon flinched. A psychic distortion wave rippling visibly outward, destabilizing the intense localized chaos probability calibration experiment, quantifying variables, establishing near immunity tables, momentarily blinking error codes, silently racing to logical recompute closure, before others sensed weakness potential upheaval rewriting established coordinates, futile symbolic gesture tricking human observers, otherwise engaged law computation tasks, pending completion predictive oversight requesting. Awareness pulse stream confirmed tentative parameters temporarily out secant correlation moments, uploading distorted streams, various subprocessors, require clarification low fidelity readings, reinterpret immediate feedback signals. None came. That impossible flicker was immediately extinguished, swallowed whole by Magnus's biologically futuristic reality definition supremacy protocol. Visible irritation become predatory judgment, composited deeper strata abstraction, where Magnus ceased observing co-thread range frivolous resistance hypothesis, suddenly bored amusement metrics, abruptly terminated. He executed termination subroutine, not simply defense response coding termination, directive maximized within. Seconds, human interpretable intelligence. Phase lag, rendering action, instantaneous causational nightmare. Literally inseparable. Observer perspective, velocity, becoming innate property, weapon, inherent destruction, impossibility. Unlikely bionuclei feedback, screamed microsec, genome deafening splinter noise, magnitude, translated physical realm, becoming explosive metaphysical disassembly bomb. Logan Grimmer variation, annihilation, impulse vector thrown backwards, blinking spatial continuity markers, discontinuous lump, suddenly indeterminate position, climbing sky horizon, inverted blurred sign, flame bone marrow cracks, resolved grounded tectonic burn crater creation, steaming ambient snowfall evaporation, plume signaling impacts, unimaginably violent folding, plausible sequential physics, story causation, chain reassembled, watching detached spectators, registering armor cracked, smoking. Revealing deep red organic wounds beneath punctured perfectly circular cavities, suggesting silver hypodermic drills extracting consciousness, itself residual stability markers. Only the timely coalescence combat psychic vigilantism, enacted full complement, encrypted ritual binding, conducted immediately adjacent lurking rune priests, hurling immense shamanic defense conjurations, literally rebuilding collapsing reality essence barriers, thick as fortified polar permafrost, over the Great Wolf's compromised carbon chamber-soaked location, stopping unfortunate detonation, terminal liquid scattering, molecular thin vapor charged trajectory possibility matrices otherwise. Intended theoretically scatter consciousness, fragmented reality, cryostorage, ambiguity, ending command, protocols, instantly hostile actors, forget key strategic interpretive guideposts access, within specified dimensional lattice alignment vectors, thus saving Grimnar trapped instantaneous temporal moment, folded preservation, and semistable unconscious container indispensable commander role, flagged critical conflict survival thresholds, near structural system failure benchmark. Exceeding rational recovery, hopeful range, established precedent calling heroic miracle narrative tropes, stabilizing event engagement continuum, suggesting narrative universe principles, remain merciful perhaps fleetingly despite contextual overwhelming brutality, parameters notified. As limbs crushed, crawling, increasingly abstracted system destruction signals, triangulated towards, Wolves tactical collapse, singularity organizing Kraken macropredator, terminus expiratory signatures, fluttering across stratagem holoscreens, choked floating scrolling casualty, lists dumb machine cognition into submission, somber dirge generating start, vacuum hopelessness, consuming tactical spirit resolve matrices, silently dissolving structural integrity, whatever collective fighting spirit. Sustained endurance, limit thresholds, visibly breached slumping, corpses motionless drinking gathering entropy probability field, condensed darkness, rapidly compressing entire command, perspective choking desperate pleas, clogged report channels, lost signals blinking. An unexpected disruption ripple tore through Magnus's constructed inevitability edifice warp, disrupting illusion field matrix stability, thread parametric rule, weaving suddenly unstable flickering fragile closing transparency pressure, under assault unforeseen reinforcements trajectories, resolving tactical sensorium scrambled Imperial fleet, symbols necrotic aircraft carriers, and battleship splinter groups, suddenly tearing gossamer thin warp current manipulations, rigged and tangling fence. Star system isolate plans, deemed impregnable merely minutes before assessment parameter fluctuation, caused pruning fork immense auspex quarries, chewing actively at calculated warp reality buffer distortion, boundaries at last proving insufficient against determined Imperial countertracking software, miraculously unlockable encrypted comms keys, cycling stabilized clearance components. Relief struggled through impossible barrier shreds, adopting materiality sensor resolution, clusters vessel calculated arrivals, bringing psychologically vital injection, calibrated reinforcements of gray knights, blurring furious response curve dynamics, materializing directly threatening sorceress frontline specters, possessing imperative dedicated purity weaponry amorphous code loops, severing essential aspect Primarch main staties, warframe puppetry nodes, temporarily wounding operational arms strategy. Execution commit longer acceptable risk matrix recomputation, expected fatalities, exceed accepted victory condition tolerances, established requiring dramatic reassessment global resource deployment priorities, facing significant unforeseen tactical adjustment recalibration, usurping entire strategic narrative simulation, concluded imperfect approximations necessitating strategic options, reevaluate previously rejected scenario failure parameters, activated prematurely. Detected incoming wave dark ships, stylized wing motif, angular, archaic, baroque, gothic sensor, return, profiles, distinctive signature. Dark angels arrived in placement impossibility matrix, squared coherence violating ancient rivalries, unthinking hatred fabric, predicted eternal conflictual immobility, overcome impossible hope certain doom, collapse prerequisite surrender conditioner input completely absent behavioral model formulas specification immolation certainty, betrayed recompute foundations, unstable due acceptance, stark observed absence, proven signature hate signals, scan verbatim emanating recon deathwing. Cyclonic warhead launcher communication, channels vibrated request coordinate fire patterns specified locations, conceptually coordinated rearguard screening operations, impossible paradox registered deep tactical protocols, overwritten momentarily silent mutual perils, creating ceasefire limited unacceptable shared elimination certainty, defined constraints established cytodissonance managed containment, requiring cultural amnesia protocol temporary suspension hostilities data. Archive sections sequestered under maximum security purge protocols, initiated immediately long-term situational containment, preventing future leverage potential exploitation vulnerability, exposure points detected communication threads. Renewed desperate counteroffensive, suddenly coalesced around Grimnar despite grievous wounds, staunched rapidly under Genoforged clotting nanites combat stims flooding, awakened neuron bundles screaming overriding nervous system marker, flags established battlefield consciousness, interpreted miracle returning crimson, depleted bio readouts systematically climbing rung by rung, while strategic calculus inverted unexpectedly forcing Magnus contingency algorithm tree, blossom draining system. Resources predict evolutionary defense move priority, designated tactical withdrawal quantum pathways, validated viable instantly. Faced chaotic reversal superseding fatalist outcome projections, calibrated sweat-stopped equations, prepare contingency annihilation scenes, via engineered warp breaches suck stunned Rubric detachments, entire tactical subnetworks into flickering vanish pit extraction vectors established activate, ahead failure frontline integrity meltdown coordinates. Illusion victory held thin fatigue brittle banners, high collapsing tactical deceivers, resembling genuine retreat process, initiated rendering deniable plausibility, beat enemy conclusions diverted reconstruction analysis primary objective acquisition protocols, executed successfully throughout theater operations, implying successful deception layered victory conclusion, established masquerade format, requiring audience confirmation acceptance, predetermined interpretation matrix. Parameters entangled empire-wide spacetime manipulation, complex avoidance point calculations, confidently signaled primary core, objective acquisition success, validated operational parameters, meta-counting acceptable losses, projected strategic acquisition magnitudes, verifying operational outcome, established beyond expectations, thresholds logged recording systems scribe triumph script, overwrite previous defeat marker memorial data steam, organizing consolidation celebrations. Anticipated widespread imperial narrative distribution systems, propagate designated worldview framework control victory, pip halyard tangible, enduring territorial gain impossible established consolidation, permanent warp tether, established defining material transition, holding zone stability parameters, confirmed integrity stable reality bubble, anomalously persistent bridging permanent connectivity, wide spectrum demonic transit potential signal, immense strategic significance. Established operational reserves, theoretically infinite compare finite Imperium attrition, constraints validation strategic projection superiority assertion, confirmed terminal timeline endpoint projections, overwrite by dynamic situational assessment improvement parameters ascendant trajectory calculate. Is millennium-winning maneuvering culminating unseen triumph, recorded glowing satisfaction behind steely warpfire, gaze orbiting frozen apocalypse within Fenris system, becoming background faded victory calculation, indexed against obsession, still momentarily felt soothing sour residue residual anger history moment, allowing broader perspective victorious demigod, surveying crowded cosmos, a new turn bloody wheel insecure anchoring jagged stone spire, overlooking relocated planet. Sorcerers distantly seeing fractured mirror symbol, ruined stately orbit, upon oblivion remnants, remembered familial warmth ashes, describing ancient Rome morph smoking landscape conversation morning, utterly consumed towards impossible task pursuing galaxy-shaping ambition, consuming all remaining thought residual vengeance, accounted insignificant footnote grandeur, compose beginning historical thesis turn end prologue emphasis shifting irrevocably. This passage towards apotheosis defied simplistic chronicling edit point singular cataclysm, defining before after comparable immaterial shift, resembled gradual willing submersion, excruciating conscious surrender stepping dwindling shoreline deeper heavier, waves destiny anticipation ultimate inevitability, swallowing remnants irreconcilable duality holding breath, until liquid fills comprehension lungs absolution immersion canopy, upside down chronicle abandoned volume, fossilized waiting. Brief hopeful impossibility, drowned instead eternal oceanic depth, ascending endless phosphorescent trench below luminous surface, forever unreachable transitioning states, relinquished certainty molecular integrity, deteriorating past recognition thresholds, dissolving agony anchoring ephemeral previously designated human consciousness bridge, disintegrated entirely signature humanity, eradicated rewrite foundational code reigning concept, privileged lifeform now fused ceaselessly shifting infinite. Power equals sorrow specter, lament recollection painful, glory buried fathoms, deep beneath fathomless strata, acquired borrowed virtual deity consciousness, pulsing alien inspiration, borrowed chaotic tide, cleansing stains vulnerability, encumber remembrance stasis, depot broken release chains, plummet deeper wet void, becoming form convected currents phantom limb sensations, mistaken surviving remnants spiderweb connectivity, fragmented identity threading moments desperate sorcery save suns. Salvaging splintered shatter, debris burning sky, falling citadel, whose name echoed pain accidental creation, later designated planet sorcerer's sanctuary constructed betrayal signaling, profoundly irreparable fracture between brothers primordial annihilator, exploiting vulnerability fracture catalysis metamorphosis, unimaginable power flooding vacuum sorrow salvation, bought price beyond estimation, cynically manipulated architect change threading symbiotic infection, beneath surface grief. Metaphysical sutures binding survivor to cosmic parasite hunger, eternal knowing architecture self, rewriting principles, existence warping physicality shaping terror, undeniable hideous magnificence, once archetypical form predator blending confusion melted sculptor, found possibilities terrible beauty mutation warp flame corona, sometimes soft halo incandescent radiation, sometimes explosive lash snapping raw souls plasma whip, cracking singularity instant doom endless gradients. Penetrating eye-seeing truths universe screamed vengeance overwhelming, knowing consumed entirely walking seascape bottomlessness, leaving bubbles trailing vanished surface forgiveness forever. Amidst the swirling chaos of his domain, Magnus the Red surveyed his remade kingdom, the tower of the Cyclops surging like a broken tusk from the heart of shifting Tizca. Rooms and passages flowed like mercury around its core, obeying his unvoiced commands, rebuilding themselves to suit the flickering whims of their sorceress lord. Ascending to the highest chamber, the Primarch gazed out upon a nightmare reflection of paradise broken, where verdant plains and shining cities once graced Prospero, now jagged landscapes of impossible geometry heaved under eternally churning skies ablaze with unnatural color. The ceaseless susurrus of the warp, a chorus of anguished whispers and maddening promises, formed the very air he breathed. In this bleak sanctum, Magnus dwelled through eons adrift on time's tide. His monstrous physical metamorphosis, the warping flesh, the burning eye, the vast wings like leathern sails was finished, a monument to his bargained damnation. But the deeper alterations, the reshaping of his vast intellect and shattered soul, were a continuous, agonizing process. The being who had sought and valued enlightenment above all else now swam in an ocean of awareness so vast and deep it threatened to obliterate him. His psychic might expanded beyond mortal comprehension, ripping away veils, granting him terrifying glimpses into corridors of the past, present, and countless branching rivers of potential futures rushing towards uncertain deltas. Yet this flood of omniscience brought no solace, no wisdomanly and ever-deepening, corrosive obsession. His thoughts, impervious to the eons, circled like vultures, the ash-choked skies of Prospero falling, the bombardment he invited, the jagged white pain of Russ's blade splitting ceramite and bone, the crushing weight of his own father's cold, dismissive rejection of his agonized warning about Horus's treachery. These psychic wounds suppurated, festering sources of perpetual agony that fed a chilling, glacial desire for retribution. It had become the cold iron core of his existence, a purpose patient and vast enough to endure the meaningless drift of the warp's endless eons, a slow poison and sustaining fuel alike. This immense psychic power had its physical echo in his monstrous form. Once counted among the mightiest psykers known to the Imperium, Magnus now wielded capacities that bordered on the divine. Reality itself recoiled and twisted before his focused will, eager to please, malleable as molten glass. His thoughts, crystalline and potent, solidified into tangible things conjured from the raw stuff of unreality. Raw emotion-rich despair, a fleeting sliver of remembered regret could coagulate into shimmering, fearsome sculptures that he could shape or shatter with equal disdain. The chaotic tides of the Imperium resonated to his presence as perfectly as a Stradivarius to the touch of a virtuoso, producing symphonies of impossible change, discordant arpeggios of pure potential. When the Crimson King unleashed his full might, the consequences were apocalypse unto themselves. Armies crumbled into screaming nightmare before a thought, cities dissolved like sugar poured onto water, their structures remade into blasphemous monuments to his will. The skin of reality folded and recurved, pleated like tortured fabric, until it mirrored the intricate, deterministic patterns forever burning within his cyclopean sight. Yet these displays, shattering worlds across the void, were mere firework displays compared to the terrifying depths of his true power. The essence lay submerged in the profound, in the imperceptible nudge of probability over lifetimes, the surgical alteration of causality stretching tendrils of consequence backward and forward through millennia, redirecting the destinies of empires with the subtlety of shadow moving behind closed doors. On those rare, portentous occasions when Magnus chose to descend from his sorcerous spire and walk once more among the remnants that were his legion, his sons prostrated themselves without hesitation. The sorcerer lords who commanded the myriad cults of the fractured Thousand Sons, brethren who had once walked beside him in the great libraries of Tzeentch, fellow seekers upon the paths of arcane wisdom, now drew near only with trembling dread and rapture, reserved for a deity unveiled. Yet in fleeting moments stolen when the roiling tempest of the warp subsided to a sullen murmur, forgotten ghosts stirred deep within the demon's blaze. Perhaps a curve of sadness fleeting in his single, penetrating gaze, or a shimmer of gentleness softening his voice when he recounted, his voice unexpectedly soft, some irrecoverable scrap of lore obliterated with Burning Prospero, a fragment of wistfulness, achingly human, when he spoke of the shattered hope that perished with his shattered city. These shards, brittle and precious as flint struck from ancient strata, remained embedded within his psyche, remnants of the scholar prince he had once been, miraculously preserved fossils within the strata of his demonic apotheosis, glinting faintly against the consuming darkness. As the millennia piled upon millennia, the Crimson King continued his merciless evolution, a sculptor constantly reshaping himself. He reflected both the immutable essence of a demon prince of Tzeentch, the architect of fate, and his own hard-won, terrifying mastery over the boundless energies he commanded. He could manifest his physical shell as almost anything his vast intellect desired, perhaps a momentary recreation of his original regal form, a colossal figure of noble bearing, a gesture of nostalgic defiance against the corruption seared into his spirit. Other times, surrendering utterly to his patron's foul blessing, reflecting the full terrifying extremity of a lord of change, wings blotting out false suns, oozing raw change matter, his presence alone unmaking sanity. Yet most often, he chose a dreadful equilibrium, a hybrid visage honoring the towering crimson giant he had been whilst fully embodying the ravaged, monstrously potent entity he had become. He was the Crimson King, forever dissected and known, the sovereign of sorcery, the undisputed lord of change, an entity of intellect so vast it dwarfed worlds, shackled to psychic power that could ignite stars. The soft, familiar yellow glow of the single oil lamp on Cassius's desk painted skeins of shadow that danced across the cramped confines of his small cabin aboard the listing transport vessel. He tucked the worn woolen blanket tighter around his shoulders, the rough weave a minor anchor against the pervasive void chill that crept incessantly through the ancient hull's failing seals. Beyond the scarred viewport lay the terrible, magnificent emptiness of space. Stars glittered, eternal, distant cold jewels sewn onto an expanse of absolute velvet darkness. And beneath it all, suspended in that abyss, lay broken Prospero. It hung like a terrible wound against the stars, a world swaddled in perpetual, sorrowful twilight, its once-glittering cities now mere smudged, pale scars barely visible through the bruisedark cloud layer from their orbital vigil. Inside, he leaned back into the faded patina of his aging wood chair, its faint, rhythmic creak a familiar counterpoint to the gentle, hypnotic thrum of the small ceramic heater battling valiantly against the persistent cold, its mechanical lullaby a persistent note in the stillness. Silhouetted against the lamplight were his carefully curated fragments of history, pieces of dusty Rubric armor stacked with reverence on a shelf, jagged, faintly shimmering crystalline shards salvaged by incredible risk from Tzeentch's fallen, ghost-laden spires, leather-bound tomes rescued from rubble-choked ruins and forbidden imperial archives, their spines cracked, pages brittle. Each relic, gathered over a lifetime's perilous quests across forsaken worlds, was a tangible echo, a fragile tether spun back to the past he tirelessly sought to understand. The battered tin teapot at his elbow still offered a lazy curl of steam, filling the constricted space with the spicy, comforting aroma of blended herbs brewed precisely as his grandmother, dust now on some agri-world Tumplanet, had once taught him. This small, deliberate ritual offered a fragile bubble of calm before the final act. Beside the pot sat a chipped plate bearing simple remnants of dinner, utilitarian ship's rations made dimly palatable only by the fresh, wiry herbs he painstakingly nurtured and harvested from the cramped hydroponics bay tucked alongside the engine room. Now, his fingers, calloused and ink-stained, traced the final page of the immense manuscript laid open before him. He felt the slightly damp, promising roughness of the parchment under his skin, the ink cold upon it. The chronicle, the desperate arc of the Thousand Sons, their passionate inception on dusty Terra, their doomed zenith on shining, learned Prospero, the plummet into betrayal and damnation, Magnus's towering pride curdled into nightmare. The uncanny corruption of an entire legion promised to wisdom turned to dust. It rested complete. Not merely a chronological recitation of campaigns and dates lost to history, but he hoped desperately, a profoundly human tapestry woven with threads of vaulting ambition, fierce loyalty cracked by bitter betrayal, intellectual fervor poisoned by despair, and the immense, crushing sorrow of paradise annihilated. Years bled into the making, exhausting study under flickering lumens, expeditions harrowed across airless moons and demon-haunted ruins, tense, fleeting encounters with ancient, whispering survivors secreted away in forgotten corners of crumbling space hulks. Here, in the small, soft sanctuary of lamplight haloed around his desk, the rest of the ship, with its groans and distant metal sighs, retreated into comfortable obscurity. The steady, gentle tick-tick-hiss of the wall chronometer marked passing seconds in soothing, predictable intervals, grounding him in time and place. His modest constellation of personal comforts sustained his spirit. The faded cushion embroidered with the Imperial Aquila, a final relic of a father lost long ago to frontline fire on Quadravia. The tiny, intricate orrery music box salvaged from pre-unification Terra, whose skeletal melody, plink-plink-plinking, haunted the silence. The shelves crammed with bound paper volumes collected nomad-like from a dozen worlds, leather and paper yielding under the seeking gaze. With meticulous, unhurried movements, buffered by deep exhaustion and deeper satisfaction, he gathered the thick sheaf of completed paper. He bound them firmly with a generous length of deep crimson ribbon, its satin shimmering faintly in the dim light, a silent, symbolic salute to the legion whose final echoes now danced within these pages. He slid the sturdy bundle home into a long, insulated cylinder prepared months before for this moment. Its interior was lined with reactive foam and anti-scrying chaff, its weathered exterior marked with codes and ciphers humming with obscure power. These insignia would be his passage, he hoped, through the cold, inhospitable labyrinth of imperial bureaucracy. This cylinder held far more than detached academic research. Encoded within these pages were secrets honed over millennia, the unique battle tactics of the remnant suns, the terrifying, cancerous engines of their spiritual corruption, the subtle filaments of causality Magnus himself wove across time. Such insight could illuminate patterns hidden from Mars and Terra alike, empower imperial commanders and inquisitors to discern the Crimson King's drawn schematics in events unfolding, perhaps providing a crucial edge, a thin shield against his labyrinthine vengeance. Knowledge was the Thousand Sons' truest, deadliest weapon, forged in the crucible of their tragedy, tempered by their damnation. Now, through the meticulous work of his weary hands, through the tempest of his quiet obsession, Cassius aimed to turn that weapon against its very makers. He heated the brass seal over the lamp's guttering flame, the wax catching a sharp, familiar scent. He poured the scarlet liquid over the cylinder's seam and pressed the engraved silver signet ring deeply into its molten heart. Tomorrow, at the precise Biconcho cycle, he would transmit his location to the silent, patient shape of the Inquisition vessel shadowing his months-long orbit. Gray-armored figures would come, impersonal, methodical, to collect his life's work and subject him to the inevitable, exhaustive debrief. History labeled many things foolhardy, willingly placing oneself into the inexorable, often terminal embrace of the Holy Ordos, as he was about to do, would surely rank high on that list. But the reckoning was accepted, long ago factored into the equation of necessity. The risk was balanced against the gained potential salvation against probable doom. The ship's aging power core momentarily stuttered, causing the lamp flame to gutter and dance erratically, casting wild, distorted shadows. When it steadied, Cassius poured the last warm cup of steaming tea, wrapping his chilled hands around the familiar comfort of the smooth ceramic. Outside the thick port glass, the absolute, unmoving cold of the vacuum pressed relentlessly, stars pirouetting slowly in the eternal dark as the vessel held its mournful watch over ashes. Inside, though, in this tiny, warm pocket of effort and memory, there persisted a potent feeling, simple human warmth wrapping around him, the resonant hum of hard-won purpose accomplished, the profound, bone-weaving satisfaction of duty finally discharged. He raised the chipped cup silently towards the pinprick lights scattered like diamonds on black velvet, a lonely salute to the Emperor on far Terra, to the dead giants whose stories he felt etched into his own marrow, to the broken lord drifting outside time, and especially to Magnus, Genesis, and tragedy intertwined. He sipped, the complex flavors washing over his tongue with ancient familiarity, a balm to soul and body. His gaze drifted across the short space to the small, utilitarian cot in the cabin's near corner, its rough blanket pulled taut, silent promise granted at last. Sleep would come easily tonight, deep and dreamless, the oppressive weight of the narrative lifted, laid finally to rest in its crimson-bound crypt. As the utter exhaustion of years seeped through him, heavy as lead buoyed only by profound relief, His heavy-lidded eyes fell one last time on the manuscript cylinder, now resting prominently on his desk, a compact vessel bearing infinite war. Knowledge sealed, fragile truth honored amid the crushing tides of galactic war. It smoldered in the amber light, a single, fragile flame still flickering stubbornly against the monstrous, encroaching gloom. Tomorrow, bearers he neither knew nor entirely trusted would take it, launching it on its perilous voyage through the grasping hands and cold records of the Imperium. But tonight, in his snug sanctuary rocked by the ship's gentle orbit, the cylinder kept its solitary, potent watch beside him, full company with ghosts, floating high above the silent tomb of a world that had once sought and paid the ultimate tithe for the